Hi there, you're listening to the Hellenistic Age Podcast, Episode 77, The Indo-Greeks, Invasion of the Yavana Rajas. Despite the collapse of the Greco-Bactrian kingdom in the mid to late 2nd century BC, their successors, and in some cases rivals, continued to prosper in India. The Indo-Greeks, a term coined by the scholar Awad Kishore Narayan in his landmark book of the same name, refers to the political successors of the Greeks of Bactria that established themselves in an area approximating to southeastern Afghanistan, Pakistan, and northwestern India. These kingdoms, for there was not just one, lasted from roughly 185 BC until the early 1st century AD, decades after the traditional ending date of the Hellenistic period with Cleopatra's death. Much to our misfortune, we are left with even less information and sources on the Greek rulers of India than those of Bactria. Conversely, we gain access to a collection of various Indian authors and inscriptions which, when used with caution, provide us with a more complicated view on the nature of Hellenism. Prior to the 4th century BC, the Greeks understood very little about India, a place which was perceived to be at the ends of the earth. Tales from early authors like Herodotus, Ctesias, or Hecataeus suggest a land of riches or a sort of primitivist utopia, along with a collection of outlandish creatures like people with dogs' heads, or gold-digging ants. Relying on these accounts to get an accurate picture of India during this period may be about as useful as relying on mythological stories of Heracles or Dionysus, who were said to have visited India in the ancient past, but they no doubt form the basis of what later travelers envisioned as what lay beyond the mountain range of the Hindu Kush. Most of this early information would be received by the Greeks from second- and third-hand sources from the Persian Empire, which absorbed Gandhara and turned into a satrapy by the time of Darius I. According to Greek tradition, Darius commissioned an Ionian sailor named Scylax of Carianda to sail down the Indus River in approximately 515, who later published a report on his findings, making him the earliest recorded Greek to have visited the Indus. Most authors seem to agree that India was prosperous, containing a wide array of goods and an enormous population. To visit it, never mind attempting to undertake a military expedition there, would place any would-be adventurers or warlords into the realm of the divine. In the spring of 327, Alexander the Great and his army departed from Bactria southward across the Hindu Kush, marking the beginning of 6 centuries of close contact between the Mediterranean and South Asia. This was not a mission of goodwill and peace, but one of conquest, as Alexander was compelled to expand his empire ever farther. While the Greeks were impressed by cities like Taxila, this did not deter them from plundering the countryside and sacking several towns. Much like the campaign in Bactria, the invasion of India was marked by many brutal acts, as the unfamiliar climate and fierce resistance from the natives, who were many in number and prone to using war elephants, took a toll on the Macedonian soldiers as they marched throughout the Punjab. After triumphing in a hard-fought battle against King Porus at the Hydaspes in 326, Alexander's troops had grown tired and refused to march past the Hyphasis River, the modern Chenab, though the news of even greater Indian kingdoms that lay beyond the Punjab, namely the Nanda Empire, had excited the king with the prospect of further conquests. This was the final straw for his men. After a few days of sulking, the king eventually acquiesced to the demands of the army and proclaimed an end to their journey. At the banks of the Hyphasis, Alexander is said to have ordered the construction of larger-than-life altars and statues of the Olympian pantheon to commemorate his journey and mark the furthest limits of Greek civilization. From there, he proceeded to lead his army down the Indus and return home along the coast of the Indian Ocean and the Persian Gulf. The participants of these Indian campaigns ended up authoring their own accounts of India. King Ptolemy Soter of Egypt, Nearchus the admiral, and Aristobulus the court historian, to name a few. Their observations would heavily supplement the writings of later Greek and Roman authors like Strabo, Arrian, and Pliny the Elder. Like in Bactria, Alexander sought fit to appoint a mixture of Macedonians and local Indian leaders as heads of these new satrapies. King Takshiles was to govern the region of Gandhara from his capital of Takshila, while the other kings Porus and Sophitos would manage the rest of the Punjab. The Greek commanders, such as the Macedonian general Python in the southern portions along the Indus, and Philip to the north, were left behind as well to ensure their good behavior. Ironically, the Greeks themselves would prove to be the biggest troublemakers. Philip was murdered in 325 by the Greek colonists that were settled in the region, and Porus was assassinated by Philip's successor Eudamus 10 years later. Both Python and Eudamus would eventually be drawn into the wars of the successors and killed, and the satrapies were left largely to their own devices. One of the few references to the Indian provinces during this period was the forced relocation of the elite Macedonian Silver Shields unit to Arachosia, a punishment for their betrayal of Eumenes of Cardia. Outside of this event, numismatic evidence shows that Sophitos was able to strike Hellenic-style coins in his own name, a reflection of his increased independence or willingness to employ Greek mercenaries. Without any direct supervision, it seemed that the Indian provinces would break away in time. Shortly after the departure of Alexander from India, an important figure arises in both the Greek and Indian historical record. Chandragupta Maurya, also known to the Greeks as Sandrakatis, was a man of unknown origins who led an uprising against the ruling Nandus and conquered much of the Magadha region, establishing the Mauryan Empire. Greco-Roman authors believed him to have been of a humble background, while Indian accounts are sharply divided in opinion and heavily mythologized. The timing of Alexander's invasion of India and the rise of Chandragupta was not lost upon the Greeks either, nor to recent scholars as well. Authors like Justin and Plutarch envision a meeting of some kind between Alexander and Chandragupta, the former acting as the inspiration for the latter's imperial ambitions, though whether the future Indian emperor ever laid eyes on the Macedonian king is uncertain. Having consolidated the former Nanda Empire, Chandragupta likely took advantage of the instability of Alexander's former satrapies and reclaimed much of their territory, restoring the borders to as they were under Persian rule. This westward expansion would not go uncontested. In roughly 305, Seleucus I Nicator was in the middle of his eastern anabasis, intent on restoring Macedonian authority to the upper satrapies, including the Indian provinces. A war was fought between Seleucus and Chandragupta, with the former leading his army across the Indus River to confront the Indian emperor. Little is known about this conflict, but the sources agree that by 303 a treaty was signed between both rulers which contained 3 clauses, the first being a marriage alliance, the second was the transfer of the most distant satrapies like Arachosia and Gandhara to Chandragupta, and the third was the delivery of 500 battle-ready Indian elephants to Seleucus. While the elephants seem like a paltry exchange for such huge tracts of land, a hint of how the war may have not gone in his favor, these fearsome beasts would nevertheless play a decisive role at the Battle of Ipsus in 301, when Seleucus and a coalition army defeated the forces of Antigonus the One-Eyed and Demetrius Poliorcetes. Seleucus's inability to conquer Chandragupta's armies was a subject of ridicule by his enemies, as Demetrius's followers mockingly referred to him as the Master of Elephants. Ribbing aside, the performance of the elephants at Ipsus would ensure that they would continue to play a major role in Hellenistic warfare, and many Indian elephant riders, mahouts, would travel to the Mediterranean to serve as mercenaries in the armies of the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. Following the Treaty of the Indus, the Maurya turned their attention to the rest of South Asia, of which large portions remained independent. Both the second emperor Bindusara and his more famous successor Ashoka would greatly enlarge their empire through a series of conquests, including a particularly bloody war waged by Ashoka against the Kalingas. By 261, the Maurya were in control of the largest empire to ever emerge out of the Indian subcontinent, stretching to the Bay of Bengal in the east, Afghanistan in the west, and as far south as the state of Tamil Nadu. Rather than continuing to seek a policy of expansion, Ashoka is said to have undergone a religious epiphany following the devastation wrought by the Kalinga War, and converted to Buddhism, dotting the Indian landscape with rock and pillar inscriptions espousing his religious idealism. Despite their rocky introduction, The relationship between the Hellenistic kingdoms and their Indian neighbors remained amicable throughout the 3rd century. Around 300, Seleucus sent an ambassador named Megasthenes to the court of Chandragupta, in the city known as Palambothra to the Greeks and Pataliputra to the Indians, which approximate to the modern site of Patna along the Ganges River. Megasthenes wrote an eyewitness account called the Indica, which unfortunately has not survived outside of fragments and paraphrasing by later authors, but it contains discussions about a wide array of subjects, ranging from elephant hunting to the administration and layout of the empire. Though his interpretations of what he saw are sometimes a little suspect, cross-examinations with native sources like the Arthashastra and archaeology have demonstrated that Megasthenes was rather astute in his observations. His main goal for writing the Indica is also unclear. Perhaps he intended to provide an assessment of the Mauryan Empire's military capabilities for the Seleucid government should they consider another invasion, or perhaps to reflect the Seleucid imperial worldview and justify Seleucus' withdrawal from India. Regardless, the Indica remained the most accurate and reliable European account of India until the medieval period. Other Greek envoys also made their way to Pataliputra, namely the Seleucid official Dimachus of Plataea and the Ptolemaic diplomat Dionysius during the reign of Chandragupta's son Bindusara. Our classical sources have also recorded a few instances of gift exchange between the great powers of the Mediterranean and South Asia. Seleucus was presented with some of India's flora and fauna by Chandragupta, namely aphrodisiacs and anaphrodisiacs, along with a tiger which was regifted to Athens. Bindusara requested a collection of Mediterranean goods from Antiochus I Soter, including figs, wine, and a philosopher, though the last request was supposedly not honored on the grounds of morality. Emperor Ashoka's understanding of the political situation in the Mediterranean is made apparent on one of his rock edicts, as he provides a list of all the various kings he dispatched emissaries to: Antiochus, Antiochus I or II of the Seleucid Empire; Ptolemaya, Ptolemy II Philadelphus of Egypt; Anticyna, Antigonus II Gonatas of Macedonia; Macha, Magus of Cyrene; and Alyaxhudala, Alexander II of Epirus. Following the death of Ashoka in the late 230s, the Mauryan dynasty underwent a decline in power. Signs of this were already apparent when the Seleucid king Antiochus III journeyed into India during his own eastern anabasis in 206. Rather than dealing with any of the Maurya directly, Antiochus appears to have established or renewed an alliance with an Indian king named Sophagasinus, perhaps Subhagasina, just south of the Hindu Kush. This man was either an independent lord or some sort of vassal king of the Maurya, but he provided Antiochus with many elephants and treasure as a symbol of his friendship. In roughly 185, the last Mauryan emperor, Brihadratha, was unceremoniously assassinated by his commander, Pushyamitra Shunga, the founder of the Shunga dynasty. With the death of the last Mauryan ruler, India divided into several kingdoms of varying size and importance in absence of a strong imperial authority. The Shunga retained the imperial heartland around the Ganges, and large portions of the Bay of Bengal. The Satavahana dynasty continued to expand throughout the Deccan Plateau in central India, and the Tamil kingdoms of the Cholas and Pandyas flourished in the south. The fragmentation of the Mauryan realm is important to understanding the invasions of the Greco-Bactrian kings. Northwest India was a turbulent region, even under Mauryan rule. In his early career, Ashoka was sent to the provincial capital of Takshila to quell a rebellion that broke out there, and given the dealings with Sophagasinus, it stands to reason that these were the first areas to slip from imperial control. The Greeks in Bactria were no doubt well informed about the events taking place, especially for its rulers at the beginning of the 2nd century, the aged Euthydemus I and his son Demetrius I. Their agreement with Antiochus III meant that a western expansion into Seleucid territory was out of the question, but India was wealthy and politically divided, ripe for the picking for any prospective conqueror. Tales of Alexander and Seleucus's wars against Porus and Chandragupta must have filtered down to Demetrius, and it is likely that they were aware of the murder of Brihadratha. By the year 185, Demetrius led an army south across the Hindu Kush and into Arachosia, reinstating Greek rule over a century after it had been delivered by Seleucus to Chandragupta. This event can be dated with some confidence, thanks to the calendrical system used by the Indo-Greek kings. Inspired by the Seleucid model, the Greeks in India had their own epoch by which to measure the passage of time. While year 0 in the Seleucid era dates to 312-311 BC, the Indo-Greek era starts in approximately 186-185. This would line up nicely with the Indian campaigns, and it is presumed that either Demetrius or his successor instituted this new system. The Kulyab inscription of Heliodotus, dating to about the same period, suggests that the campaigns had started when Euthydemus was still alive, a necessary arrangement if Demetrius needed to secure his holdings in Bactria as he marched out with his army. To celebrate his successes, Demetrius issued coins bearing his portrait, with an elephant scalp adorning his head, a symbol of his eastern victories and an image often associated with Alexander as well. Demetrius may have also had the distinction of being the only Greco-Bactrian ruler to have a surviving bust in his image, based on a faience sculpture discovered in Ai-Khanoum. Archaeological evidence of the Indian conquest may also be found in Ai-Khanoum's treasury. In addition to finished goods like ivory carvings, there are also coins of various types from India. And inventory documents written in the mid-2nd century give sums based on Karshapana currency from Takshila, alongside the standard Greek drachma. Copro-nickel coins minted by the rulers immediately following Demetrius were probably the result of ingots being taken as loot or tribute, rather than gaining the knowledge on how to make the alloy themselves. The Chinese possessed the ability to forge copro-nickel though, and it is possible that these ingots made their way from China to India before being taken by the Bactrians during a raid. Demetrius is certainly the best documented ruler in both the Greco-Bactrian and the Indo-Greek kingdoms, and his epithets and coin imagery are centered around his military achievements. The Kulyab inscription calls him Callinicus, glorious victor. Strabo also attributes the expansion of the Bactrians into India, at least in part to Demetrius, and Isidore of Carax reports the existence of a city in Arachosia named Demetrius, which presumably was founded by Demetrius either during or immediately after the invasion of the region. W. W. Tarn believed that Demetrius should be considered the premier conqueror of the Indo-Greeks, while Narayan argued that later kings, notably Menander I, should receive the credit. In either case, after Demetrius' invasion into Paropamisidae and Arachosia, there would be at least two sets of kings ruling at any time, those based in Bactria and those in India. Following his death in the early 180s, Demetrius' Indian domains were likely overseen by the figures Agathocles and Pantaleon, who either ruled contemporaneously or in short succession, since they both minted copro-nickel coins, along with Euthydemus II in Bactria. Agathocles holds a particularly unique position in the numismatic record. He was the first known Greek king to issue coins with bilingual legends, one written in Greek and one written with the Kharosthi alphabet. He was also the first to follow Indian customs by striking square-shaped coins, rather than the traditional round or circular type. This suggests that he may have overseen the transition of Greek power into the Punjab, perhaps capturing the city of Takshila in the process. The circumstances surrounding his background are rather unique, since he minted a series of commemorative or pedigree coins based on the past rulers of Bactria: Alexander the Great, Euthydemus I, Demetrius I, and the curious figure Antiochus Nicator, who was either Antiochus I of the Seleucid Empire or a third Diotodid king. We can assume that Agathocles was a son of Demetrius I, given the frequency of Euthydemuds in the series, and the coins may have been intended to celebrate the conquests in India. Takshila was also the first major Indian city to submit to Alexander, so evoking the long-dead Macedonian king's image was an appropriate act. As the Euthydemid rulers settled into their new holdings, events transpiring in Central Asia would result in serious repercussions for the Indo-Greeks. Around 170, the famous Eucratides overthrew the Euthydeman line in Bactria and proclaimed himself king. His ambition eventually led him to campaign in Arachosia, resulting in a clash with an Indo-Greek monarch named Demetrius, likely Demetrius II Aniketos. According to Justin, Demetrius put up a spirited defense against the attacks of Eucratides, even driving the Bactrian ruler into a local city and placing him under siege for 5 months. But Eucratides managed to escape the blockade and establish himself as the master of Arachosia, presumably with Demetrius being killed or driven into exile. Such a victory would not last for long, however, as Eucratides would be murdered by his son during the return to Bactria shortly before 145. The Greco-Bactrian kingdom, taxed by the wars of Eucratides, would soon crumble and fall apart over the next decade, as they faced invasions, civil wars, and successive waves of migrating tribes from the Eurasian steppe, like the Saka and Ueshe. With Bactria falling apart, the Indo-Greeks needed to reconsolidate after the turmoil inflicted by Eucratides' invasion. The man most responsible for the kingdom's restoration was Menander I Soter, whose reputation would surpass all other Greek rulers of Bactria and India alike. According to the Milinda Panha, a Pali Buddhist text featuring Menander as the titular character, he was said to have been born in a village called Kalasi. If we are to believe this story, this would imply that Menander was of humble origins, since royalty tends not to be born in a hamlet, but it is more likely that he was part of the Euthydeman family. One of the most striking images on Indo-Greek coins is the presentation of the goddess Athena Alkademos, holding the aegis and wielding a thunderbolt, and she was Menander's deity of choice. While the Euthydemans are traditionally associated with Heracles, Athena was also present on the coinage of Demetrius II, and Menander made sure to include the club-wielding demigod on some of his strikes as well. Menander probably took the throne around 155, making him a contemporary of Eucratides, but whether he clashed with the Bactrian king after Demetrius II's death is unclear. The assassination of Eucratides must have taken enough pressure off the young monarch, allowing him to restore order to his kingdom. Using Gandhara as a staging area, Menander and the other Indo-Greek kings were able to lead a series of invasions that penetrated deep into the heart of India. Classical authors like Strabo say that the Indo-Greeks pushed farther than the Macedonian conquests of the 4th century, and that Menander personally surpassed Alexander in the number of peoples he defeated. The anonymous writer of the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea claims that there was visible evidence of Alexander's campaigns, fortifications, siege works, and even religious shrines in the region of Barigaza, modern Bharuch in Gujarat, during the 1st century AD. If they are indeed Hellenic in origin, then they would have to be attributed to the Indo-Greeks, since Alexander never got past the Punjab. Our same author also speaks of the coins of Indo-Greek rulers like Menander being circulated in Barigaza's markets, so this may indicate that they managed to get as far south as the Bay of Kambat. But most dramatic is the evidence from classical and Indian sources describing their easternmost campaigns, which suggests that the armies of the Indo-Greeks reached the Ganges River and besieged Pataliputra, the former capital of the Maurya as described by Megasthenes nearly a century and a half before, now in the hands of the Shunga dynasty. One of the most important Indian sources on this period is known as the Yuga Purana, an astrology text written in Sanskrit that, despite being delivered in a prophetic manner, provides a summary of historical events. In it, we get the following passage about the invasion of the Indo-Greeks. Quote, "Then, having approached Saketa together with the Pankalas and Mathuras, the Yavanas, valiant in battle, will reach Kusamajava. Then, once Pushpapura has been reached and its celebrated mud walls cast down, all the realms will be in disorder, there is no doubt." End quote. Kusamajava and Pushpapura are alternate names for Pataliputra, which lines up with Strabo's claim about passing the Punjab and reaching the Gangetic plain. And as they follow the lower Ganges on their way, the Greeks also sacked the important cities of Mathura, Saketa, and Pankala in Uttar Pradesh. Attempting to date the siege of Pataliputra and the invasions is extremely difficult, as there is a wide range of possible answers. A reference to this invasion may be found in the work of Patanjali, one of the great Indian grammarians of antiquity who appears to have been contemporaneous to these events. In the Mahabhashya, a text supposedly written around 150 BC, Patanjali speaks of the Yavanas besieging Saketa and Madhyamika in the modern state of Rajasthan. The 5th century playwright Kalidasa composed a drama based on the life of Pushyamitra Shunga, and within it he mentions a battle fought between the cavalry of the Yavanas and Pushyamitra's grandson, Vashumitra, over a wayward horse on the banks of the Indus. The Yuga Purana also states that the Greeks were forced to abandon their siege of Pataliputra, for some sort of war had broken out back in their homeland. Perhaps this is a reference to the invasion of Eucratides, or even the civil wars and disorder that plagued Bactria following his death. These various accounts need not be confined to a single event, and the Indo-Greeks could have led more than one raid into the Indian heartland, be it under Menander or other kings. For all intents and purposes, the reign of Menander is viewed as the apogee of the Indo-Greek Kingdoms, and is where we will pause our narrative for the time being. As we did in Central Asia, let us go over the major settlements of northwestern India during the Indo-Greek period. In contrast to Bactria, there is no equivalent to an iconum in terms of a preserved city, and many sites have remained occupied, with the Hellenistic level being buried under thousands of years of accumulated debris. Positively identifying these layers or other city foundations as being Greek in origin with the limited sources we have is a severe challenge. But in recent years there has been extensive archaeological work done in the region, and we can optimistically look forward to new developments following the release of this series. Takshila, known as Takshashila in Sanskrit, was one of the most important cities in ancient India, located near the riverbank of the upper Indus River in the Punjab. It was the first major settlement in India encountered by Alexander, ruled over at the time by the king Takshiles, and the Greeks were impressed by its size and organization. With the expansion of the Mauryan Empire, Ashoka the Great was sent there as a young princeling to oversee it as a provincial capital, and it was generally thought of as an intellectual and cultural center by both Greeks and Indians alike. Confusingly, Takshila seems to have moved around a bit, or given birth to sister cities throughout the millennia, though is generally contained within the same approximate area. The original site as seen by Alexander was likely situated on the Behir Mound, but by the 2nd century another location was established to the north, just across the riverbank at Sirkap. Given Takshila's strategic importance, it was almost certainly done on the order of the Indo-Greek kings to act as their new administrative capital of Gandhara. According to a biography of a Greek named Apollonius of Tyana, who is said to have traveled in India during the 1st century AD, Takshila is described as large as Assyrian Nineveh, and Hellenistic in its design. It possessed extensive fortifications, streets organized akin to Athens, bungalow-styled houses with only a single floor and basement, baths, gardens, and temples. The author claims that a shrine still displayed bronze tablets listing the deeds of Alexander the Great and King Porus alike, in addition to paintings that were similar in style to Greek frescoes. While this rather sensationalized account needs to be treated with caution, archaeological evidence also appears to confirm a strong Greek presence among its cosmopolitan population, as the excavations of Sir John Marshall during the early 20th century have provided a wealth of information about the site's organization and layout. Sirkap was constructed on the Hippodamian grid, in contrast to the original site's less rigidly structured streets. Both Corinthian and Ionian columns can be found, as are Hellenic-inspired temples. Both Takshila and Sirkap were occupied at the same time, and served important roles in the Indo-Greek administration. But perhaps like Babylon and Seleucia on the Tigris, Takshila was more conservatively Indian than its Greek sister city. Still, there are clearly local Gandharan and broader Indian influences on the makeup of Sirkap, as evidenced by the presence of several Buddhist stupas which, in turn, for artistic designs inspired by Western motifs. An inscription from modern Vidisha confirms that at least one Indo-Greek king ruled from Takshila, namely Antiochus I, but their control over the site probably went back to Agathocles. During Indo-Greek rule, a mint was established at Sirkap, as evidenced by the discovery of over 12,000 coins in excavations of the site. Monograms denoting the use of the Takshila mint have been found on a number of Indo-Greek rulers, including the aforementioned Antiochus and another named Lysias. This city would later serve as a major political center long after Indo-Greek rule, during the time of the Indo-Scythians, Indo-Parthians, and the Kushans. A city that gets much attention from the Indian sources is Sagala, or Sakala, situated near the modern Sialkot in the Punjab. According to the Milinda Panha, this was the capital of Menander, and we get the following passage, quote, "There is in the country of the Onakas a great center of trade, a city that is called Sagala, situated in a delightful country, well-watered and hilly, abounding in parks and gardens and groves and lakes and tanks, a paradise of rivers and mountains and woods. Wise architects have laid it out, brave is its defense, with many and various strong towers and ramparts, with superb gates and entrance archways, and with the royal citadel in its midst, white-walled and deeply moated. Well laid out are its streets, squares, crossroads, and marketplaces." End quote. There is no direct mention of Sagala by the Greco-Roman sources, though we get a confusing reference by Ptolemy the geographer of a similarly located city named Euthymedia, which has sparked a flurry of debate as to whether this should be amended to Euthydemia after the Greco-Bactrian ruler. Among the plains of Peshawar in Pakistan and close to the junction of the Kabul and Swat rivers, one can find a number of large mounds that jut out from the land near the area of Charsadda. Excavations from this site have revealed a large Hippodamian grid, and it has been identified as the Indo-Greek city of Pukealotis. Frequently mentioned by multiple authors, it must have been a place of considerable importance. It was possibly named after the Indo-Greek king Pukolaos, with coin finds demonstrating his existence, or perhaps other Macedonian officials in Alexander's army sharing the same title. During the Kushan period, the city was moved again, and was known by the Indians as Pushkalavati, though whether Pushkalavati is an Indianized rendition of Pukalautis, or the other way around, it remains uncertain. The latter might be more accurate, as the city seems to have been occupied at multiple stages, probably serving as a regional capital of Gandhara for the Persians, and re-established under the Indo-Greeks. According to the Greeks and Romans, Alexander is said to have founded an Alexandria within or near the vicinity of the Indian Caucasus, a term confusingly used to describe the Hindu Kush mountain range. Archaeologists have yet to firmly locate this city, but evidence for its existence is supported by Pali texts that repeatedly refer to an Alessandra, a name that bears an obviously strong resemblance to Alexandria, and it is explicitly described as a Yona city. Many believe that Alessandra and Alexandria in the Caucasus are one and the same. Yet some argue that this Alexandria should be identified with the Afghan city of Bagram, situated about 80 miles north of Kabul. Bagram's reputation is due more to its role as a summer capital of the later Kushan Empire, also known as Kapisa, and was the site that saw the discovery of a large treasure hoard, appropriately named the Bagram Hoard. Whether it is valid to consider Bagram and Alexandria in the Caucasus to be a single location or two, there is evidence of a Hellenistic occupation throughout the Greco-Bactrian and Indo-Greek periods. The 19th century explorer Charles Masson managed to find thousands of Greek coins while digging in the city's ruins. Along the Arghandab River in southern Afghanistan, only a few hundred miles from the border of Pakistan, lies the city of Kandahar. Adjacent to the modern urban sprawl is a large elevated citadel known as Shar-e-Kuna, or Old Kandahar, which served as its historical center for thousands of years prior to its destruction in the late 18th century. It has generally been agreed upon, though not without reservations, that Kandahar served as a major city during the Hellenistic period and probably bore the name Alexandria in Arachosia. Perhaps the most frequently cited connection between today's settlement and that of its old is its current name. Kandahar is derived from the Iranian Iskandar, which in turn is derived from Alexander. This seems cut and dry, but just because the name is a variation of Alexander doesn't necessarily mean that it was derived from Alexander the Great himself. Few literary accounts speak of Alexander's city founding in Arachosia, but there are several writings that hint at Alexandria's existence. Isidore of Carax mentions the city of Alexandropolis, and describes it as being adjacent to the Arachotis River, which matches that of current Kandahar. Strabo and Pliny the Elder talk of a settlement sharing a similar topography, though the name they give is Arakotoi, probably the city's original Iranian name. Given its strategic location and elevated position, it is likely that the Macedonians renamed a previously occupied site that dated to the Persian period or earlier. All sources recognize its commercial and political importance, as Isidore explicitly calls it the metropolis of the region, and Greek in identity. A historian of Han China named Ban Gu speaks of a city known as Wuyi Shanli, the terminus point for merchants traveling between South and Central Asia. Ban Gu also found the currency of the city to be quite unusual, since they depicted the king's face, which would fall under the Hellenistic model of coin designs. Given this information, we may be able to confirm that the historian is speaking of Kandahar, and that Wuyi Shanli is a transliteration for Alexandria. Despite the centuries of habitation making it difficult to penetrate the layer of Greek occupation, Kandahar's importance during the Hellenistic period is testified by the archaeological and epigraphical remains that have been uncovered. Emperor Ashoka of the Maurya saw fit to have his edicts inscribed upon rocks and pillars within the outskirts of the city during the mid-3rd century BC, notably in Greek. Other Greek inscriptions have made their way out of the site, the most important of these being a funerary epigram of a man named Sophitos, which will be discussed later, and another important inscription was dedicated by a man known only as the son of Aristonax, who had placed it out of thanks for being rescued from the predation of a wild animal. Quote, "This statue of the wild beast, I, the son of Aristonax, having been rescued from its attacks, set up in this sacred glen among my fellow countrymen." In antiquity, India was considered one of the most populous and wealthy lands in the world. Herodotus claims that under the Persians, Indian vassals contributed about 530 talents worth of treasure to the great king in the 5th century, much of it in alluvial gold dust collected from the riverbanks. Gemstones, namely rubies, pearls, agate, and others, were considered one of its most valuable exports, and Pliny the Elder called India the great producer of the most costly gems. Gandhara was keenly situated as a major nexus point for traders moving between Central and South Asia, perhaps traveling on imperial highways that had been previously established by the Maurya. It also may be assumed that the Indo-Greeks were able to capitalize on the growing trade between China and the West. In his account of Central Asia, Zhang Qian was surprised at the amount of Chinese goods that were available for purchase in the markets of Bactria, despite the minimal amount of contact between China and the rest of Central Asia. The Bactrian merchants explained to him that they picked up these products from India, presumably referring to the cities of the Indo-Greek Kingdoms. The author of the Milinda Panha fawned over the prosperity of Menander's kingdom, reciting a checklist of goods available in Sagala. Products such as jewels, perfumes, textiles like muslin, all and more were available for eager buyers. Quote, "So full is the city of money, and of gold and silverware, of copper and stoneware, that it is a very mine of dazzling treasures. In wealth it rivals Uttarakuru, and in glory it is as Alakamanda, the city of the gods." End quote. With their wealth, the Indo-Greeks carried on the tradition of minting spectacular coins, and scholars have come to depend on them far more for their reconstructions of chronology when compared to those in Bactria. Portraits of the Indo-Greek kings appear much as they did in Central Asia, all wearing the diadem and often shown equipped in Hellenistic military garb. While only one royal lady has been discovered on the coinage of Bactria, we have at least 3 that appear in the Indo-Greek record, and 2 of them struck their own coins, though they both appear to have ruled jointly with either their husbands or sons. In the 1st century BC, Amyntas I ordered the striking of the largest silver coins of the ancient world, double the size and weight of the Attic standard, and measuring around 65 millimeters, 2.55 inches in diameter. These coins could be quite the travelers. Coins minted by Menander I have been found as far west as Hampshire County in Britain, presumably passing through the hands of traders before being brought by Roman officials. Olympic deities like Heracles, Zeus, Apollo, and Dionysus all grace the reverse side of these strikes, and so we can still distinctly see an emphasis on Hellenic identity being communicated through their coinage. Unlike their Bactrian counterparts, however, these coins adhered much more to local custom, to an extent that was unmatched by any of the successor kingdoms in the West. From the perspective of numismatists, the Hindu Kush may be viewed as a sort of cultural monetary divide. Coins minted by those living north of the range, such as the Greco-Bactrians, would be based on the Attic standard of 4.20 grams per drachm, while those ruling in the south relied more on lighter Indian standards of 2.45 grams. Neither the Ptolemies nor the Seleucids ever put local languages like Egyptian or Aramaic on their currency. But with the Indo-Greek specimens, we often find bilingual legends. These primarily are in Kharosthi, a type of script popular in the Gandharan region, but they could also be written in Brahmi, used for classical Sanskrit, the common version Prakrit, and Pali. Generally speaking, these legends are usually a close match, as the Greek title of king, Basileus, is paired with the Kharosthi Maharajasa, Great King, or the Brahmi Rajane. Much like how the Rosetta Stone aided in the decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphic, these bilingual coins were invaluable for 19th century scholars looking to decipher early Brahmi, which had gone extinct by the 5th century AD. The Norwegian Indologist Christian Lassen used the coins of Agathocles to work backwards, comparing the Greek legend Basileus Agathocleus of King Agathocles to the Brahmi Rajane Agathoclesa. While Hellenistic coin types are universally circular in shape, the Indo-Greeks minted several variations that were square, which had been the norm in India from the Persian and Mauryan period onwards. These tended to be smaller denominations in bronze, intended for local use, but there were also silver species sharing this format as well. Alongside the standard Hellenistic imagery, many Indian motifs and designs make their appearance on them as well. The humped cattle breed known as zebus, lions, the 8-spoked wheel, and elephants. More striking is the explicit appearance of Hindu gods. The two confirmed deities are Vasudeva, an aspect of Krishna, and Samkarshana Balarama, the elder brother of Krishna. In some instances, we see a blend of iconography that combined aspects of both the Hindu and Olympic pantheon. For instance, Antiochidas I's coins show Zeus Nikephoros, bringer of victory, riding upon the back of an elephant, a feature that could be viewed as syncretism between Zeus and Indra. It is important that we assess the Indian perspective of the Greeks. For much of the Hellenistic period, the term used by the Indians to describe the Hellenes was Yona or Yavana. This was derived from the Persian word Yona, which itself was adapted from Ionian, the Greeks living in Asia Minor. Eventually this became a general catch-all name for any peoples west of India, including the Saka, Parthians, and the Romans, who would eventually establish contact through the maritime trading networks of the Red Sea and Western Indian Ocean. Context usually indicates which group is being referred to, though it sometimes creates problems of identification, such as during the end of the Indo-Greek period and the arrival of the Saka and Kushan. Brahmin texts like the Mahabharata categorize Greeks as belonging to the same general group as barbarians, viewing them as mlechas, living outside of the caste, and all the negative baggage that comes with the term. Later writings were more flexible on the matter, as the usefulness of the Greeks as political and military allies was quite apparent, but the inherent mistrust still remained. The nature of caste in ancient India remains controversial, and there are many sound arguments demonstrating the lack of rigidity in such categories. It was, however, something that Greek observers like Megasthenes reported on, to varying degrees of accuracy. This notion of caste hierarchy may cause us to read certain events in Greco-Indian history in a different light. As I briefly mentioned earlier, included in the terms of the Treaty of the Indus between Seleucus I and Chandragupta Maurya is a reference to some sort of marriage arrangement. Traditionally, this is thought to have been an exchange of a Seleucid princess to Chandragupta, to solidify their agreement, which is not too out of the norm for royal politicking at the time. The term used to denote the marriage is quite vague, however, and some scholars suggest that rather than referring to the handing over of one of Seleucus's daughters, the marriage alliance was a renegotiation of marriage rights between the Greek colonists in Arachosia and Indian women. As foreigners and miletias, Greeks would be outside of the caste system, barred from intermarrying with the local communities. This would be a problem given the limited number of women that took part in the initial waves of Hellenistic settlement of the East. Yet how much weight should we place in this idea? And could the number of Greeks living there have been substantial enough to warrant this negotiating point? While direct Greek control over Arachosia was brief, there are hints of a strong degree of continuity for the Hellenic colonists living in the area. In 259-258, Ashoka carved a royal edict upon the rock face just outside of Kandahar, celebrating the 10th year since his coronation and espousing his Buddhist beliefs. Rather than being written in Sanskrit or Prakrit, Ashoka ordered that it be copied into two versions, one in Aramaic, a lingua franca of the Iranian plateau, and one in Greek. Another inscription was set up later, this time just in Greek. Whoever translated the emperor's edicts was clearly educated and held a strong grasp of the Greek language, and the fact that it was written in Greek at all suggests that the Hellenic population living in Kandahar was large enough or held enough political power to warrant it. How did the Indians react to the influx of Greeks into the subcontinent? There is plenty of evidence to suggest that there was hostility towards their arrival. Alexander's invasion routinely saw massacres and fierce resistance by the locals, and the later campaigns of the Bactrians likely did not engender themselves either. The Matsya Purana, composed under the patronage of the Shungas, reflects this anti-Greek sentiment by describing the events of the invasion of the Yavanas. Quote, "There will be Yavanas here by reason of religious feeling or ambition or plunder, massacring women and children and killing one another. Kings will enjoy the earth at the end of the Kali age. They will be destitute of righteousness, affection, and wealth. Mingled with them will be Arya and Milecha folk everywhere. They prevail in turn, the population will perish." End quote. Undoubtedly, the conquests were violent, and competition between the various Indo-Greek rulers would have resulted in further turmoil. If we are inclined to accept the idea that the Indo-Greeks were often generous patrons of Buddhism, then perhaps these feelings were magnified as part of the Brahmins' resentment of the support that competing doctrines could receive. The Shungas were the first explicitly Brahmanical dynasties since before the time of the Maurya, whose rulers could be associated with Jainism or Buddhism. In contrast to the hostility of the Matsya Purana, the Pali Buddhist text, the Milinda Panha, more on this work later, holds a generally positive outlook on the Indo-Greeks, whom they call the Yonakas. Though revered more for his connection to Buddhism, Menander is viewed as a just and fair king, his capital of Sagala well organized and wealthy. As we have discussed in previous episodes, excavations in Central Asia have provided us with a wealth of information to suggest the establishment of a flourishing Greek culture in Bactria. Yet there is little evidence for the Indo-Greeks, who, despite occupying Pakistan and northwest India for centuries, have left barely any evidence of their existence outside of their coinage. Greco-Roman writers champion Demetrius and Menander as conquerors rivaling Alexander, but remain quiet with regards to the finer details of the Indo-Greek kingdoms. Indian authors are only a little more talkative, but do not speak in terms of Greek culture or civilization making its way into South Asia. No ruins of an Indo-Greek city equivalent to Ai-Khanum, perhaps other than Takshila, have been found, and up till relatively recently, there were no text or inscriptions within Bactria in India indicating that Greek intellectual culture persisted in any significant degree. The apparently ephemeral nature of Indo-Greek rule led Narayan to assert that, quote, "The Greeks came, the Greeks saw, but India conquered," that the supposed Hellenizers have been overcome by the pull of India's rich cultural history. But the last few decades have proven to be quite fruitful, and work by researchers and archaeologists alike have added a great deal of complexity to the discussion. This is a theme that will carry over for the rest of our series, but let us look at the evidence that we have regarding the identity of the Indo-Greeks. There are two substantial inscriptions dating to the Indo-Greek period, invaluable case studies regarding the perception of self-identity within Hellenistic India. The first is known as the Sophitos stele, a limestone block measuring about 24 by 24 inches, 62 by 62 centimeters, and dated approximately to the 2nd century BC. Scholars only learned about the existence of this tablet in the early 2000s, since it belongs in the hands of a private collector. Ethical qualms aside, this specimen was found in Kandahar, one of the few pieces of evidence of a Hellenistic culture in Arachosia. Inscribed upon the block are 22 lines of Greek, a funerary epigram for a man named Sophitos, or Sophites, son of Neratos. Sophitos tells us of his history, discussing how he managed to restore the family fortune by becoming a merchant after leaving his home in Alexandria and Arachosia. Quote, "The irresistible force of the trio of fates destroyed the house of my forefathers, which had flourished greatly for many years, but I, Sophitos, son of Neratos, pitiably bereft when quite small of my ancestral livelihood after I had acquired the virtue of the archer and the muses, mixed with noble prudence, then considered how I might raise up my family house. Obtaining interest-bearing money from another source, I left home, keen not to return before I possessed wealth, the supreme good. Thus, by traveling to many cities for commerce, I acquired ample riches without reproach. Becoming celebrated, I returned to my homeland after countless years and showed myself, bringing pleasure to well-wishers." End quote. Neither Sophitos nor Neratos are Greek names. They are likely Greek transliterations of Subhuti and Narada, names of Indian origin in their Prakrit form that would have been reasonably commonplace during this time. As I mentioned earlier, a king Sophites of the Punjab was received by Alexander and made a satrap, so there is some corroborative evidence to support an Indian ancestry. However, Sophitos does not share any other information to indicate his ethnic identity or background, so we aren't able to exactly read the context of his Greekness. Yet whomever is the author of this epigram, either Sophitos or perhaps one of his children, they held a great command of the Greek language and were well versed in Greek literature. Hints of Sophitos' education are evident when he refers to his acquisition of the virtue, arete, of Apollo and the Muses. The lines are directly evocative of Homeric verse and archaic technical language, including at one point a parallel of the opening passage of the Odyssey. His epigram is also an acrostic, a term referring to a poem or prose where the first letter of each line forms another line. In this case, the acrostic text reads vertically, "Through Sophitos, the son of Neratos." Evidently, Sophitos' learnedness was something he considered to be a point of pride and wanted passerby to recognize from reading his grave marker. It certainly indicates that Alexandria and Arachosia was a multicultural city that possessed a strong Greek intellectual tradition. Was Sophitos eager to emphasize his Greekness as part of being some sort of cultural or intellectual elite of the area? His rags to riches story lent itself well to the idea of a nouveau riche merchant keen on displaying his personal achievements, but we can't say that Sophitos was explicitly trying to appear Greek, since we don't know enough about the context of Sophitos' background to draw any conclusions about his intent. The second important inscription is in modern Vidisha in the state of Madhya Pradesh, formerly the ancient site of Besnagar. There stands a sandstone pillar, measuring a little over 7 meters in height. Others were probably adjacent to it as well, but this specimen remains the only survivor. Known as the Heliodorus pillar, named after its dedicant, it was set up in approximately 110 BC. The text reads as follows, quote, "This Garuda pillar of Vasudeva, the god of gods, was constructed here by Heliodora, the Bhagavata, son of Dia of Takshashila, the Greek ambassador who came from the great king Amtalikita to King Kashiputra Bhagabhadra, the savior prospering in his 14th regnal year. These 3 steps to immortality when correctly followed, lead to heaven, control, generosity, and attention." End quote. There are many elements here to dissect, but let us first talk about its context. Besnagar was an important trading center during the late 2nd century BC, home to King Kashiputra, perhaps a vassal of the Shunga Empire. Ruling from Takshila, Antiochidas I, who otherwise is only attested to in numismatics, sent out his ambassador Heliodorus, also a native of Takshila, to visit Kashiputra and establish some sort of relations or a possible alliance. There is little ambiguity when compared to the origins of Sophitos. Heliodorus and his father Dion's names are very much Greek, and he explicitly calls himself Ionadutena, Greek ambassador. Yet unlike Sophitos' use of the Greek language, Heliodorus wrote his inscription in Prakrit, the common tongue of India, using Brahmi letters. Even more curious are his references to Vedic religion. The term Bhagavata specifically denotes a worshipper of the god Vishnu, or better understood as the incarnation Krishna Vasudeva, who is also mentioned as the recipient of Heliodorus' honors. Vasudeva is also one of the only identifiable Indian deities to be found on Indo-Greek coins, namely those issued by Agathocles around 180 BC. His cult was prominent in the region, and the specific terminology employed by Heliodorus implies a high degree of familiarity. At the very least, the ambassador was looking to impress the local Indian community with his knowledge and patronization of Hindu deities. On the other end, we might be looking at the writings of an explicitly Greek devotee or convert to the cult of Vasudeva, who probably had a local branch in Takshila. Additionally, the portion referring to the 3 steps of immortality is believed to be a recitation of a verse from the famous Indian epic, the Mahabharata, further evidence suggesting Heliodorus' deep knowledge of Indian religion and mythology. Like in Ptolemaic Egypt and Seleucid Mesopotamia, there is also strong evidence for the use of double names, whereby a single individual can have 2 names of distinct cultural origin, one of which being for personal use, likely the culture they most identify with, and the other for legal or administrative purposes. We have seen examples of local Babylonians or Egyptians adopting Greek names, but in the case of both Sophitos and Heliodorus, we only get a single name that is extrapolated by modern scholars. However, inscriptions discovered in Gandhara have shown the use of both an Indian and a Greek name. The first is a seal with the name Denukrata Sagarakshita. Denukrata is the Indianized rendition of Dinocrates, and Sagarakshita is a more traditionally Indian name, with the Karash of the inscription telling us the name of Imdravarma, who also had the Greek name of Alexandros. It is impossible to tell the ethnic or cultural background of these 2 individuals, but they do indicate that the double name convention was being practiced to some extent or another. Returning to Indo-Greek coinage, it speaks volumes as to how much they followed Indian custom, the use of local languages and alphabets, the depiction of Hindu and Buddhist religious iconography, and the use of Indian coin standards and shapes. For most of the Hellenistic world, coin money was almost always a typically Greek medium and communicated as such. Neighboring Bactria adhered to this tradition, but the Indo-Greeks quickly deviated from the practice following their establishment in the Punjab. Yet the evidence does suggest that these Hellenistic kings ruled in a similar manner to their contemporaries, that Greek intellectual culture was still practiced, and the Olympic pantheon was venerated in the tradition of their ancestors. One notable example is Menander's use of the goddess Athena Alkademos on his coinage. The epithet Alkademos means defender of the people, an incarnation that is specifically tied to Macedonia. To conclude our discussion, we must recognize that the Indo-Greeks had acclimated to their new cultural environment, and adopted several elements to suit their own purposes to a degree that differed from the contemporary Hellenistic kingdoms. Some may take this as evidence of their wholesale Indianization, which is certainly strengthened by the evidence, or perhaps the lack thereof. It is important to note, however, that the Seleucids and Ptolemies were also keen to weave themselves in the fabric of both the Near East and Egypt respectively, that they took on the roles as arbiters or patrons in the local religious customs of the populations that they ruled over. If all we had were the Egyptian temples that portrayed the Ptolemies in the same mold as the traditional pharaohs, or Babylonian tablets showing the involvement of the Seleucid kings in Babylonian ceremonies, would we not face the same dilemma as we do with the Indo-Greeks? Yet we do not dispute the Hellenic origins and court culture of those dynasties. But this may precisely demonstrate the dynamic and sometimes problematic nature of Hellenization, Indianization, or any other comparable terms. We can clearly see, though, that the world of the Indo-Greeks was complex, but we do not have the insight remotely comparable to Hellenistic Egypt, or Syria, or Mesopotamia to make any assumptions outside of rough guesswork. What needs to be done is not just to rely on scrutinizing everything with a Greek lens, but to view from a variety of perspectives to make our best attempt at reconstructing one of the most fascinating unknowns in world history. Hi there, you're listening to the Hellenistic Age Podcast, Episode 78, The Indo-Greeks, Pericles, Menander, and the Buddha. The region of Gandhara, encompassing much of Pakistan and eastern Afghanistan, was a major hub of political, commercial, and cultural activity in the ancient world. One of the most important contributions of the region was the cultivation of Buddhism, one of the great religions of the world that had been established centuries earlier by Siddhartha Gautama, later known as the Buddha. It is no surprise that during their invasion of India, the Indo-Greek kings made Gandhara their base of power. Following nearly 2 centuries of occupation, a mingling of Buddhist and Hellenic traditions occurred in Gandhara's cosmopolitan environment, manifesting in both art and literature in powerful and enchanting ways. From its origins in roughly the 5th century BC, Buddhism was largely a philosophical movement, rather than a strictly religious one. The figure known as Siddhartha Gautama, or Shakyamuni, sage of the Shakya clan, had established his teachings in the region of Magadha along the lower Ganges. In the centuries after his death, it remained localized in the Gangetic plain, but the rule of the Mauryan emperors would provide the opportunity to propel it to the status of a major world religion. Ashoka the Great, the third of his dynasty who ruled from roughly 268 to 232, became a similar figure as Constantine was for Christianity. After a particularly brutal conquest of the Kalinga peoples along the Bay of Bengal, Ashoka experienced something of a moral epiphany over his warlike behavior, and in his repentance, he found himself a devoted patron, if not convert, of Buddhism. Under his direction, thousands of monuments and temples were built across his empire, and missionaries carrying the Buddha's message were sent throughout India and beyond. While its modern population is overwhelmingly Muslim in practice, Gandhara received many of these missions, and Buddhism became deeply entrenched in the region, giving rise to a core of Buddhist practice and scholarship for over 1,000 years. Gandhara's position along the trade routes linking India with the rest of Central Asia and the more western territories made it a very attractive location for prospective conquerors, namely Alexander the Great and the later Greco-Bactrian and Indo-Greek kings, both of whom invaded the region during the 4th and early 2nd centuries respectively. Classicists and Indologists alike have sought to find any piece of evidence to suggest an interaction between the traditions of Buddhism and Hellenism. It turns out, there is a surprising amount. Did Alexander or his contemporaries encounter any Buddhists while in Bactria in India? According to the biographer Diogenes Laertius, a man named Pyrrho of Elis had accompanied the expedition, and while in India he is said to have convened with local ascetics known as the Gymnosophists, literally naked wise men. It is from their conversations that Pyrrho was inspired into a life of contemplation, becoming the founder of what is known as Pyrrhonian skepticism. The core philosophy behind this skeptic outlook is due to the fallibility of perception, that the qualities of objects are unmeasurable or unstable based upon the point of view of those expressing them. For instance, what is hot for some may be lukewarm to others, which leads to equally valid arguments on both sides, which can result in the inability to act or decide, equipolence. According to Pyrrho, we thus know nothing, and to avoid a state of distress or impotence brought about by this lack of knowledge, we must be perpetually indifferent to our surroundings by suspending our judgment, leading to ataraxia, tranquility. This indifference and general relaxed attitude results in some amusing anecdotes, with Pyrrho nearly being run over by carts in the street, or bitten by rabid dogs, seemingly without a care in the world. Scholars have noted that Pyrrhonian skepticism and Buddhism share many similar outlooks regarding the nature of the universe, and even in the ways that they argue their beliefs. The tripartite argument of Pyrrho, lack of identity or viewpoint, unstable or immeasurable characteristics of objects, and the lack of decision or judgment, can roughly be equated to the Buddhist three characteristics of ethics: impermanence, uneasiness, and lack of self. Both have also employed the use of the tetralemma, a four-option equivalent of the dilemma, which can be summarized as follows. An object is either X, Y, both X and Y, or neither X and Y. Pyrrho and the Buddha would agree that we cannot firmly claim that objects are not, are and are not, or neither are or are not. This has led to the assertion that Pyrrho had been inspired by, or outright repackaged, the philosophical ideas of Buddhism through his meeting with the Gymnosophists during his time in India, who ought to be better described as Buddhist monks. This interpretation has not been widely accepted, with many citing that Indian and Greek philosophical schools have both used these argumentative structures prior to the arrival of Alexander in the East. While the Greek description of the Indian philosopher shares characteristics with the lifestyle of Buddhist adherents, namely the minimalist living, vegetarian diet, and contemplative nature, some have noted that the author's insistence on the nudity of these Gymnosophists would be more reminiscent of sadhus, Hindu or Jain ascetics, rather than any adherents of Buddhism. For an event more convincing than that of Pyrrho, we need to move about 60 years after the death of Alexander to the reign of Ashoka the Great. During his rule, he ordered the carving of several inscriptions into the faces of cliffs, caves, and large rocks across his empire. These were messages from Ashoka himself, laying out a biography of his life and his devotion to the teachings of the Buddha. Of special note are Rock Edicts 7 and 13, both of which were found in the city of Kandahar. These edicts are remarkable finds because they were inscribed in Greek, along with Aramaic, indicative of the sizable population of Greek settlers residing within Arachosia, which was ceded by Seleucus I to Ashoka's grandfather Chandragupta in the Treaty of the Indus in 303. Edict 7 has Ashoka explain the need for nonviolence, and pushes for restrictions on hunting and fishing while promoting Dhamma or Dharma, a term used to refer to a sort of cosmic law or truth, which would be the practices of Buddhism. Quote, 10 years having passed, King Piodases revealed Dhamma to men. Thenceforth he made men more pious and made all things prosper throughout the entire land. The king abstained from eating living creatures, and following his example, other men did likewise, and all who were hunters or fishermen have ceased their work. Those lacking self-control have, as far as possible, overcome their weakness, and, unlike before, have become obedient to their father, mother, and elders. By doing these things, they will live more profitably in the future. End quote. Whomever translated the emperor's message converted the word Dhamma into the Greek eusebeia, which is more specifically tied to piety, and doesn't quite match up to the meaning of the original. Piety in the Greek sense also implies animal sacrifice, which is contrary to Ashoka's aims. The Aramaic version of the text translates it as truth, which is more in line with the Buddhist meaning, and no doubt influenced by Zoroastrian belief which was widespread in the Iranian plateau. Regardless, this is concrete proof that Buddhist ideology was being shared to a Greek audience. Edict 13, on the other hand, shows the missionary zeal of Ashoka, as he states that he sent embassies to the courts of the Hellenistic kingdoms as far away as Libya and Greece. Later Buddhist literature gives a more detailed account of one of these missions, an envoy named Maharakitathera, who is said to have delivered Ashoka's message in the Yonakaloka, the country of the Greeks. While we have Greco-Roman records of diplomatic exchanges and gift-giving between the Greek kings and Indian emperors, none mention any proselytizers. Following the independence of the Greco-Bactrian kingdoms, there is little proof of an identifiable Buddhist presence within the Greek cities of Afghanistan. To say that no practicing immigrants or missionaries traveled or lived in places like Ai-Khanum is unlikely, given the amount of trade that was going back and forth between Bactria and Gandhara during the time. There was probably a degree of familiarity, but to truly find any evidence, we need to turn to the Indo-Greek period. Following the conquests of Demetrius and his successors, Gandhara was ruled by a Greek elite until the early 1st century AD, who would have to contend with the local religions and customs of their subject communities. It is during this time that we find one of the most extraordinary pieces of evidence indicating the influence of Buddhism on the ruling Hellenes. King Milinda at Sagala, the famous town of yore, to Nagasena, the world-famous sage, repaired. To him, the eloquent, the bearer of the torch of truth, dispeller of the darkness of men's minds, subtle and knotty questions did he put, many, turning on many points. Then were solutions given, profound in meaning, gaining access to the heart, sweet to the ear, and passing wonderful and strange. For Nagasena's talk plunged to the hidden depths of law and thought, unraveling all the meshes of the Suta's net, glittering the while with metaphors and reasoning high. Come then, apply your minds, and let your hearts rejoice, and hearken to these subtle questionings, all grounds of doubt well fitted to resolve. These are the opening lines of a Buddhist text known as the Milinda Panha, the Questions of King Milinda, a work written in Pali sometime around the 2nd century AD, perhaps based on a Gandhari original which was also later translated into Chinese. Its position within the Buddhist canon depends on the sect, but it was especially popular in Sri Lanka, where the oldest manuscript, dating to the late 15th century, was found. The story is centered around a meeting between King Milinda, a powerful monarch of Gandhara, and Nagasena, a Buddhist sage, engaging in philosophical debates about the merits of Buddhism. As a very wise and learned man himself, Milinda poses a series of questions to Nagasena, who takes the opportunity to articulate the belief structure of Buddhist philosophy. Eventually, Milinda accepts the wisdom of Nagasena and becomes a devotee of the Buddha, eventually becoming a saint, arahat, and achieving nirvana. Indologists and classicists alike immediately recognize the origins of this Milinda, the Indo-Greek king Menander I, who ruled Gandhara from roughly 155 to 130 BC. How do we know that the Milinda Panha is referring to Menander? On the Kharosthi legend of Menander's coins, his name is often given as Menamdra. Milinda and Menamdra are not exactly the same, but close enough to not give any special concern, as there was no standardized method to transliterate Greek names into Indian languages. More obvious is evidence from the text itself, which explicitly calls Milinda the ruler of the Yonakas, the Greeks. Given that Menander is the best documented Indo-Greek ruler in the Greco-Roman tradition, few doubt that Milinda and Menander are one and the same. And since this is the only Indian text written explicitly about the Indo-Greeks, it is little wonder that scholars have pored over its contents to try and glean any sort of information they can out of it. While the story itself is largely fictional, as it is focused more on exploring Buddhist doctrine than an account of Menander's supposed conversion, there are many elements that suggest a solid historical foundation. The description of Menander's capital at Sagala, despite its literary flourish, mentions several features that are reminiscent of Hellenistic cities, such as its organization on a grid-like pattern and possession of large fortifications. Among Menander's host were 500 appointed Yonakas, who continually provided information about his kingdom, which, despite its size, is probably referring to the Pholoi, the royal friends who served in advisory and administrative roles. Like the name Milinda, there are Yonakas in the story who seem to possess names that can be roughly approximated from Pali into Greek, such as Devamantia, Demetrius, and Anantakaya, Antiochus. Going by the historicity of the text, Menander would be the earliest known Greek, a king no less, to accept the teachings of the Buddha. Structurally, the Milinda Panha is quite simple. It takes a conversational approach with Menander acting as the curious interlocutor, who asks Nagasena about philosophical concepts such as knowledge, the fear of death, and various aspects of the Buddhist belief structure. Nagasena does his best to respond by comparing alternative solutions, challenging Menander to keep posing the right questions before finally providing the correct answer. Here is an example of the general format. Quote, The king said, "He who has intelligence, Nagasena, has he also wisdom?" "Yes, great king." "What, are they both the same?" "Yes." "Then would he, with his intelligence, which you say is the same as wisdom, be still in bewilderment or not?" "In regards to some things, yes. In regards to others, no." "What would he be in bewilderment about?" "He would still be in bewilderment as to those parts of learning that he had not learnt, as to those countries he had not seen, as to those names or terms he had not heard." "And wherein would he not be in bewilderment?" "As regards that which has been accomplished by insight, the perception, that is, of the impermanence of all beings, of the suffering inherent in individuality, and of the non-existence of any soul." "Then what would have become of his delusions on those points?" "When intelligence has once arisen, that moment delusion has died away." "Give me an illustration." "It is like the lamp, which when a man has brought into a darkened room, then the darkness would vanish away, and light would appear." End quote. For those unfamiliar with Greek philosophy, the questions read very much in the style of Plato's Socratic dialogues. Compare the previous passage with Plato's Theaetetus, where Socrates discusses the nature of knowledge and perception with the eponymous Theaetetus, and the parallels are quite striking. Given the similarities in structure and its uniquely cosmopolitan background, quite a few academics have sought to identify a Greek influence in the origins of the Milinda Panha. Hellenistic kings were generally learned men, and the patronization of intellectuals was considered the norm. Alexander is reported to have conversed with Indian sages about various subjects during his time in India, and Menander would be playing a very similar role. Scholar W. W. Tarn likened it to the letters of Pseudo-Aristeas, written in Greek, but centered around Jewish religious history and organized along a similar framework as the questions. Ptolemy II Philadelphus, a foreign king from the Jewish viewpoint, invites the intellectuals of Jerusalem to come to Alexandria, and during his banquets he poses a series of philosophical questions that are then addressed by the Jewish elders. Its historical veracity is highly doubtful, but it too contains elements of truth about Ptolemaic Egypt, and Tarn asserts that there must have been a Greek original of the Milinda Panha which has only survived in the Pali format. In Tarn's day, almost nothing was known about the intellectual life of Hellenistic Central Asia and India, so his claims certainly sounded far-fetched for the time. This has since dramatically changed. A papyrus fragment containing a previously unknown philosophical discussion on the Platonic theory of forms was discovered in the library of Ai-Khanoum, perhaps an original work by a Greco-Bactrian scholar, and it too takes on a conversational approach. The inscription of Sophitos from Alexandria and Arachosia demonstrates the educational background of a man of likely Indian origin possessing knowledge of Homer and Callimachus. It is arguable that there was a vibrant intellectual culture in the Greco-Bactrian and Indo-Greek period, at least for the elite, so perhaps Tarn's claim is not unfounded. Others have taken a different position, arguing that we should exercise caution against scouring through the questions and overestimating the amount of Hellenic influence. The pattern of back-and-forth philosophical dialogue, the so-called Socratic method, was not exclusively practiced by the Greeks, nor was the model of acquisitive king and sagacious philosopher, both of which appear in spades in Indian literature, both before and after the Hellenistic period. It is important to understand the context of when and where it was written, though, as Gandhara during this time was a hub of various cultural and intellectual traditions, and the Milinda Panha may have been relevant enough to be understood from the perspective of both Indian and Greek alike. Outside of the questions of King Milinda, what sort of evidence do we have that lends weight to the connection between Menander and Buddhism? We know that the coins of Indo-Greek rulers could portray Indian gods like Vasudeva, so we might be able to find Buddhist elements as well. So far, only one bronze coin known to be minted during the time of Menander carries imagery that may be interpreted as Buddhist, the Dharma Chakra, an 8-spoked wheel that represented the Noble Eightfold Path, a set of guidelines that empower the practitioner to end their personal suffering. There are a few important things to note when taking this coin into consideration. Firstly, the fact that only one has been ever discovered may hint that Menander's devotion was not as strong as we'd like to believe. Secondly, the 8-spoke wheel did not exclusively belong to the Buddhist tradition either, as it could often represent the general Indian concept of universal kingship. This is further supported by the fact that the bronze coin was likely meant for local circulation, so using broadly Indian symbols to appeal to the wider population would make more sense. Most of Menander's finer silver specie emphasize his military prowess, with the lightning-wielding goddess Athena Alkademos or the demigod Heracles acting as representations of his martial power. Thirdly, attempting to determine the religious conversions of a king by using their coins, especially in a polytheistic society, may be more difficult than at first glance. However, it is worth mentioning that the original Greek epithet of Menander was Soter, savior. If we are to believe that they are one and the same person, later coins changed the title from Soter to Dikaios, just, which was adopted by his successors as well. The corresponding Karaashthi reads as Maharajasa Dharmikasa Menadrasa, Great King Menander, follower of the Dharma. But the general association of Buddhism with the Indo-Greeks may not be too much of a stretch when we look at the political situation of India during the period. Earlier kings like Agathocles were willing to depict Hindu deities alongside more traditionally Hellenic elements on coinage, and we know that there were Greek devotees of the god Vasudeva, namely Heliodorus of Takshila, but patronizing Buddhism may have been a more valuable political move. The imperial heartland of Magadha and the lower Ganges was controlled by the native Shunga dynasty, and Pushyamitra Shunga was the first explicitly pro-Brahmin ruler of Pataliputra since before Chandragupta Maurya. By contrast, Gandhara, the seat of Indo-Greek power, had become a stronghold of Buddhism. Under Pushyamitra and his successors, Hindu literature like the Matsya Purana paints an extremely hostile picture of the Yavanas as bloodthirsty barbarians. Though this resentment is justified given the extent of the campaigns of Menander and other Indo-Greeks against Magadha, it may have been exacerbated by their inclination to support Buddhism. In some later Buddhist traditions, Pushyamitra is seen as a great persecutor, razing Buddhist temples to the ground and killing its members in an effort to establish unchallenged Brahmanical authority. However fair or unfair this portrayal is made out to be is really a matter of debate, since there is evidence that the Shunga generally accepted Buddhism in contrast to the supposed zealotry of its members. Regardless, I think it is quite revealing of how fondly Menander is remembered in Buddhist sources when compared to the general disdain of Yavanas in Hindu accounts, and vice versa with the contemporary Shungas in Buddhist ones. There is a very interesting passage from Plutarch regarding the king's funeral. It is said that upon his death, Menander was cremated, his ashes divided amongst the cities in Bactria and India to be interred in monuments. Cremation was common practice among both Greeks and Romans alike, so that in itself is not unusual. However, the translation leading to monument can also be substituted for memorial, presumably a grave of some kind. It is argued by some scholars that the Greeks were trying to describe not just a grave, but more specifically, a stupa. A stupa is essentially a raised earthen mound used to store the remains of the dead, and is very prominent in the Buddhist tradition, with more elaborate examples possessing a conical spire. The most common account of the Buddha's death has his body cremated, and his ashes and other relics scattered amongst his followers to be placed within the stupas across the land. Ashoka's Great Stupa in Sanchi is the most spectacular example dating near Menander's lifetime, and stupas can be found across northwestern India and Afghanistan. A later Buddhist work maintains that Menander built a stupa during his time at Pataliputra. If we are to believe that Menander was an ardent Buddhist convert, then it stands to reason that Plutarch is unwittingly relaying a story of Menander's emulation of the Buddha. It is worthy to note that Macedonian kings tended to inter their dead in structures similar to the stupa, known as a tumulus. The great tumulus of Vergina is famously said to house the remains of King Philip II of Macedonia. We are then left with a few frustrating options, all equally likely. One is that Menander was buried in much the same practice as his Macedonian forebears, and any parallels between he and the Buddha are retroactively imposed by modern scholars. The second suggests that Menander was indeed buried in Buddhist custom, but the Greeks did not understand the broader context and just saw it as an extension of a traditional Hellenistic king. Deification of royals upon their death occurred very frequently during the period, and so Menander would be just continuing the practice. The last may mean that Menander's remains could have been placed in the stupas, but the practice itself might have been seen as respecting both Greek and Indian traditions by either Menander himself or his responsible successor. Plutarch also confirms the claims of the Milinda Panha, describing him as a just and wise king that dispensed law fairly among his subjects, perhaps also a reference to the epithet dikaios. What about archaeological or epigraphical evidence? Within the ruins of a fort in the town of Shinkat along the border of Afghanistan and Pakistan, locals discovered a soapstone casket, more specifically a reliquary, a funerary urn intended to hold the relics of the Buddha. This item was discovered in the early 20th century, but has since been lost. Thankfully, drawings and photographs of the object were taken at the time, as on the casket were several inscriptions, written out in Gandhari Prakrit using Kharosthi letters. It appears that the reliquary was consecrated repeatedly on different occasions, and specialists in Gandharan epigraphy managed to deduce that these inscriptions date within a range of 150 years of each other. The oldest of these can be found on the outer rim, which reads as follows, quote, "Of the great king Menander, on the 14th day of the month of Kartika, relics of the lord of the Shakya sage that are endowed with life are established. Relics of the lord, the Shakya sage, that are endowed with life." End quote. As it stands, Menander must be a reference to our Menander, given its close similarity to his Kharosthi coin legend Menamdrasa. Most, though not all, accept the Shinkat casket as an authentic find. Starting with what we know, the casket was interred by someone during the time of Menander, and adjusted later during the Indo-Saka period. Due to a break in the text, the context as to why Menander is mentioned is unclear, and there are several possibilities. Perhaps it was originally deposited by or on behalf of the king. If we are inclined to view Plutarch's story of Menander's death and burial as carrying explicitly Buddhist overtones, then Menander would have understood, or at least recognized the significance of the ritual. If genuine, the casket is the oldest datable reference to the interment of the Buddha's relics. It could also be possible that the deposit was in honor of Menander, recognizing him as a generous patron of Buddhism. Truthfully, the answer could be as mundane as a reference to his regnal year at whatever time it was deposited. But very recent evidence has emerged that has added a whole new layer of complexity. The town of Barikat, the ancient Basira along the Swat River in Pakistan, is a site noted for its Indo-Greek influence. It was occupied by the Macedonians from the time of Alexander, and retaken during the expansion of Menander into the Swat Valley, before being heavily refortified by the Indo-Greeks due to its strategic location. In late December of 2021, an Italian excavation working in Barikat revealed that they discovered the remains of an enormous apsidal temple of Buddhist origin, its earliest foundations dating to the 3rd century BC. This would place it during the Mauryan period, which falls in line with the proliferation of Buddhism during the reign of the Emperor Ashoka. What is also important is that this apsidal temple also saw a period of construction and expansion during the mid-2nd century, lining up nicely with the Indo-Greek period. This is further backed by the discovery of silver coins of the Greek rulers like Menander, and several objects of Hellenistic origin. With a healthy degree of confidence, the excavators have concluded that the additions to the temple were due to the patronage from Indo-Greek kings, perhaps Menander. A complete investigation of the newly discovered material has yet to take place, but optimists on the project hope that it will drastically improve our knowledge of the activity of the Indo-Greeks within the Swat. What are we able to conclude with this evidence? The notion of a Greek king becoming an ardent convert to Buddhism is an idea that has fascinated scholars for generations, and will continue to do so as well. In the context of the rest of the monarchies of the Hellenistic age, the patronage and support of local religious cults and practices was very much standard operating procedure. For instance, the Seleucids took an active part in the festivals and rituals of Babylon, while the Ptolemies held a close relationship with the priests of Memphis and were generous supporters of temple building. The Greek rulers of India would have found themselves in a similar position, and it would be wise to seek the support of local religious communities to strengthen their control. We have seen their willingness to show Hindu gods on their coinage, or set up pillars in honor of Vasudeva Krishna. It is quite possible that Menander saw Buddhism as one of many Indian cults that should be paid attention to intermittently. That is not to say that we should be dismissive of Menander's connection with Buddhism as a scenario of mere political convenience or spiritual dabbling. There is too much evidence, both within the literature and archaeology, suggesting that he, out of all the Indo-Greek rulers, held a special place within the collective memory of Buddhism. A reliquary deposited by an Indo-Saka governor named Satruleka during the mid-1st century BC contains an inscription describing his actions to honor the Buddha on behalf of his family. While Satruleka, his wife Davili, and his one son Indrasena all carry names that are Indian in origin, his other son carried the name Menamdrena, Menander. It is an attractive idea to imagine children raised in Buddhist households being named after such a renowned king, and the longevity of his influence speaks volumes. While the Mediterranean authors remembered Menander as a conqueror, rivaling even Alexander, the Milinda Panha ensured that his legacy in India and the rest of Asia was that of a Buddhist saint, held in high honors as a devotee of the Buddha. Quote, "The king of the city of Sagala in India, Milinda by name, learned, eloquent, wise, and able. Many were the arts and sciences he knew. As a disputant, he was hard to equal, harder still to overcome, the acknowledged superior of all the founders of the various schools of thought. And as in wisdom, so in strength of body, swiftness, and valor, there was none to be found equal to Milinda in all India. He was rich too, mighty in wealth and prosperity, and the number of his armed hosts knew no end." While the conversion of a king is substantial, we do have evidence that even high-ranking Greek officials supported local Buddhist centers as well. A public inscription recording the patronization of a local sanctuary by an Indo-Greek administrator gives us a name and title. Quote, "By Theodotos, the Meridarch, are established these relics of the Shakya sage, the Lord, for the benefit of many people." As we move into the first millennium, there are quite a few epigraphical examples of Yavanas donating to Buddhist cave temples, but it becomes harder to pin down their exact identity given the arrival of Saka, Parthians, and Kushans into the region. Like with the Milinda Panha, there are other Pali texts that support the idea that Greeks could act as missionaries to spread the word of Buddhism. The Mahavamsa, a 5th century chronicle of Sri Lankan history with great emphasis placed on its interactions with Buddhism, speaks of a group of 30,000 proselytizers visiting the island as part of a mission of conversion. Its leader was a figure known as the Great Yona Teacher of the Dharma, clearly indicating that this person was of Western origin. Not only does the text refer to his foreign status, but also mentions that he had journeyed from Alessandra, the city of the Yonas, presumably Alexandria in the Caucasus, a region where, according to the Milinda Panha, Menander was born. Formerly on the railing of a great stupa at Bharut in Madhya Pradesh, a relief carving of a life-size man resides in the Kolkata Indian Museum. This figure shows what appears to be a warrior, holding his sword sheath with his left hand, but in his right is a grapevine, and tied upon his brow is a cloth headband of some kind. Historians have been quick to note that the headband is almost identical to the diadems worn by all Hellenistic monarchs, and along with the grapevine, these attributes lead scholars to presume that this carving is intended to be a depiction of a Western Yavana, a Greek. Given that it was found on a stupa and dates sometime around the late 2nd, early 1st century BC, it is possible that this could be referring to an Indo-Greek Buddhist convert. There is also an image of a trident on this warrior's scabbard, but rather than seeing it as a representation of the Greek god Poseidon, the trident is intended to be a Trishula, a divine symbol normally associated with the Hindu deity Shiva. The Buddhists have their own version, a Triratna, symbolizing the trifecta of Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. This Western-looking warrior is intended to be a Buddhist temple guardian of some kind, but such idealized depictions of Westerners date to the Mauryan period as well. At the Sanchi stupa of Ashoka, images of similarly attired persons wearing diadems or holding grapevines are also present, though some are a little more fantastical than others, namely one that is carried in a chariot pulled by flying lions. While Greeks living in Central Asia and India may have converted to Buddhism, is there any evidence of converts in the Mediterranean world? Given the increased mercantile trade between the Roman Empire and the kingdoms of India and Sri Lanka, they undoubtedly crossed paths at some point. Clement of Alexandria, One of the most important early Christian church fathers of the late 2nd century AD was fully aware of the existence of the Buddha. Quote, "Among the Indians are those philosophers also who follow the precepts of the Buddha, whom they honor as a god on account of his extraordinary sanctity." End quote. At the Villa Borghese in Rome, there is a marble bust that is purported to depict Julius Bassianus, a Roman nobleman of the late 2nd, early 3rd century AD, who was a high priest of the Arabian sun god Elagabal, and was closely related to the Severan dynasty. While his pedigree reflects the dynamic cultural life of the Roman Empire during this time, his portrait is extremely unusual, and his hairstyle is characteristically un-Roman. Rather than mimicking the tastes of contemporary Romans, who either preferred their hair cropped or let loose in curls, Bassianus' locks are tied up into a top knot, almost near identical to those of the Gandharan Buddhists and the Buddha himself. As we will discuss in a little bit though, this was extremely common in the work of Gandharan artists, but there is little evidence of Buddhist art making its way westward to the Mediterranean. Yet excavations along the ports of the Red Sea in early 2022 have uncovered a stone relief with the Buddha's image with a top knot, which appears to be locally made in either the port itself or even by craftsmen in Alexandria. We know that Indian traders were active in the region, and perhaps even lived in permanent communities. Potsherds with inscriptions written in Prakrit and Old Tamil have been discovered in port cities throughout Egypt, and the orator Dio Chrysostom speaks of Indians sitting among the crowds during his speeches in Alexandria. If there was going to be any Buddhist footholds in the Mediterranean world, Egypt would be the place. But we know almost nothing about the religious customs of the Indians living along the Red Sea to suggest any meaningful or secondary conversion efforts. From the 2nd to the 3rd centuries AD, during the period of Kushan rule, we see a flourishing artistic culture develop in Gandhara, which primarily manifested in the form of stone sculptures, all centered around Buddhist themes. These could be stone wall friezes adorning the stupas depicting scenes of the Buddha's life, or stucco figurines from Buddhist mythology. Ranging from small panels to life-size statues, the art of Gandhara during this period carries a rich level of realistic detail and form. I myself have seen many examples in person, and they are truly magnificent works of art. European scholars who began to encounter these spectacular pieces in the 19th century could not help but notice that the style of these Gandharan works were extremely reminiscent of the artists of the classical world, particularly from the Hellenistic and Roman periods. This connection was made even more apparent when they began to identify mythological figures or scenes that are distinctively Greco-Roman in origin. The pieces produced during this period have been commonly described as Greco-Buddhist, referring to the blend of Hellenistic artistic designs and mythology structured around a Buddhist context. Earlier academics, perhaps drawn to the association of the British Empire's Indian territories and Alexander the Great, were inclined to believe that a class of Greek craftsmen living in Bactria or India were responsible for their creation, a Greco-Bactrian school, as envisioned by W. W. Tarn. It is quite apparent that Indian artists had long possessed a tradition of skilled stone carvers, evidenced by the polished ware of the Mauryan period, or the great reliefs at the Sanchi Stupa. The Hellenistic influence is undeniable though, but it is important to highlight the abilities of local Gandharans as being fully capable of creating these often breathtaking pieces. An important question has also been raised regarding the origin and chronology of Greco-Buddhist art. As I have mentioned, the apogee of this artistic movement occurred from the 2nd to the 3rd centuries AD, nearly 200 years after the last Indo-Greek king ruled the Punjab, with very little evidence of transitory works that could show a progressive change in the artistic tastes of the Gandharans. This has led scholars to challenge the idea of a Hellenistic influence on Gandharan art via the Greco-Bactrians or the Indo-Greeks, asserting that it would have been due to the increased trade and connectivity with the Roman Empire, as Indo-Roman trade would be at its height during these centuries. Though most trade was localized in southwest India, as made clear by the periplus of the Erythraean Sea, the Kushans, who ruled over much of the former Greco-Bactrian and Indo-Greek kingdoms, eagerly imported Mediterranean goods like glassware and bronze figurines, as evidenced by the massive hoard found at Bagram in Afghanistan. Roman art was a direct successor of the Hellenistic tradition, to the point where they made exact copies of earlier works that would otherwise be lost to us. Of course, these need not be mutually exclusive reasons, and it is possible that Roman artwork was so attractive because the memory of Hellenistic culture among the Kushan and Gandharan elite remained quite strong. One of the most influential legacies of Gandharan Buddhism and its artistic output was the creation of the Buddha image. Prior to the 2nd century AD, the Buddha was never depicted in human form. It probably was not tied to matters of idolatry or iconoclasm, akin to the prohibition of the images of the Prophet Muhammad in many Muslim communities, or the fierce debates among the various Christian sects in the Byzantine Empire. Early Buddhists, stressing the immateriality of the world and the nature of the self, may have found rendering the Buddha in human form as problematic. By his nature, the Buddha is transcendent, having escaped the cycle of reincarnation and achieved nirvana. To be depicted in the human form would be somewhat contradictory to this, effectively placing an artificial limit on a being that is beyond a mere mortal man. Most employed abstract imagery such as the lotus, the 8-spoked Dharma chakra, the Bodhi tree, and footsteps to symbolize his teachings or stages of life. These images are intended to be secondary in function, and more venerated were his relics, interred in stupas across the land. By the time of Kushan rule, this dramatically changes, and the image of the Buddha becomes a common fixture in the workshops of Gandhara and the rest of Asia from the 2nd century onwards. What are the visual characteristics of the humanoid Buddha? There are different incarnations depending on the stage of life depicted. Some show him as a young man before he achieved enlightenment, others present a skeletal visage during his fasting period. But the one commonly described as the Buddha is reasonably consistent. His head is slightly enlarged, symbolizing an enlightened state of mind, his hair styled in a top knot, and in the middle of his forehead is the inward-facing eye, known as the urna. He can either be seen standing or seated in the lotus position, with his legs crossed. His arms and hands are typically posed, with his right hand at chest-high level and palm facing outwards, while his left is closer to his hips and the palm faces upwards, a gesture called Abhaya Mudra. He usually wears a simple robe or is partially nude. Such renderings, adapted to the artistic tastes and customs depending on the culture that Buddhism took root in, are almost universally understood to represent the Buddha. In their presentation, the scenes from Buddha's life are the focus of the work, ranging from his very conception to the achievement of nirvana. What sets the Gandharan examples apart, and why do we attribute some sort of Hellenistic influence upon their design or the humanoid Buddha? Scholars recognize traits in the sculptures that were near identical to the artwork of the Hellenistic and Roman periods. Gandharan artists placed a great amount of care in the clothing the Buddha wore. His robes drape and fold over his limbs and body, giving the appearance of linen or muslin being pulled by gravity despite rendering it in stone. This sort of attention to the fabric is also common to the works of the Greco-Roman world, and comparisons can be made with statues of the Roman emperors such as Augustus, dressed as per his role as Pontifex Maximus. In many instances, the Buddha's head is often surrounded with a circular halo. In the Greek world, this halo was known as a nimbus, a representation of divinity. While it could be found adorning the coin portraits of Hellenistic, Parthian, Roman, and later Kushan rulers, it was primarily used in the depiction of astral deities, such as the sun god Apollo Helios. Of all the Olympic pantheon, the Buddha closest resembles Apollo in form, a god noted for his youthful beauty. The hair of both figures are styled in a similar fashion, their slightly curled locks rendered in such a way so they appear to gently settle atop their heads, even when considering that the Buddha's hair is tied up in a top knot. When looking at the reliefs and carvings, Buddha takes the center stage, and is usually quite large when compared to his companions, likely emphasizing his importance. The use of storytelling to communicate the life of the Buddha is quite unique to Gandharan art. Buddhist art prior to this period heavily emphasized symbolic presentation, but those of Gandhara are meant to be read as a narrative. Appropriately, many of the scenes depicting the life of the Buddha are almost theatrical in their design and presentation. Like the panels of a comic book, each scene is framed and staged in a fashion that would not be out of place in Greek drama. The uncovering of the theater of Ai Khanum, Associated theatrical masks, and scraps of Dionysiac dramas all attest to its presence in Central Asia, and it would not be out of the realm of possibility that it was carried to Gandhara as well. There really are no comparisons in the Indian tradition, and while there may be some inspiration taken from the narrative friezes or theatre of the Hellenistic and Roman world, the artists of Gandhara were quite innovative. Debates have arisen regarding the origin of the anthropomorphic Buddha, split between scholars emphasizing its Greekness and those emphasizing its Indianness. In the city of Mathura in Uttar Pradesh, a school of Buddhist artwork appears to have emerged more or less at the same time as the one at Gandhara. Mathura possessed a long history of stonework, and they too began to depict images of the Buddha. In contrast to the hardened grey schist, a type of metamorphic rock employed by the Gandharan school, Mathuran artists use red sandstone, and the designs are much more Indian in character. Very little in the way of Greek influence can be felt, as there are many figures of Greco-Roman inspiration that appear in Gandharan tradition that otherwise do not in that of Mathura. It is not unreasonable to suggest that the artists of the Gandharan and Mathuran workshops had communicated and adapted each other's ideas, but determining who exactly influenced who first remains a touchy question. As such, it is worth addressing the elements that differed between Greco-Roman art and Gandharan art. Firstly, Greek gods were almost always depicted in the nude, while the Buddha remains mostly clothed. Despite the appearance of Greek mythological figures, as will be discussed in a moment, they were not worshipped as such, and the Gandharan artists had borrowed their appearance and overall characteristics to accentuate Indian Buddhist stories. While the Indo-Greeks were comfortable with using Buddhist, or at least Indian imagery on their coinage, it would not be until the Kushan Empire that the Buddha makes an appearance in full form. In the reign of Kanishka I, an important figure in the history of Buddhism, the king issued at least 3 known strikes during the mid-2nd century that show the Buddha. They include front-facing Buddhas akin to the Gandharan sculptures, both seated and standing, and contain the following inscriptions in Greek: Bodo, Sakamano Buddho, and Matrago Buddho. These are meant to represent Buddha, Shakyamuni Buddha, and Buddha Maitreya respectively, making this the early known occasion where the Buddha's name was inscribed in Greek, and one of the earliest depictions of the Buddha available. Like with the Indo-Greeks, the Kushans were eclectic in their choice of imagery on their coins, which saw a blend of Iranian, Hellenic, Central Asian, and Indian iconography. But we cannot discount the role of the Buddha among the pantheon respected by Kanishka. The creation of the Buddha's form is certainly an important development for the artists of Gandhara. In addition to the Buddha himself, a more concrete example of the Hellenistic influence can be seen in many of the designs used in Gandharan art, specifically figures and scenes of Greco-Roman mythology that were adapted and repurposed for Indian stories. Among the various scenes portrayed in the sculptures of Gandhara, there is often an accompanying figure acting as a bodyguard for Lord Buddha. To the eyes of those with at least a passing understanding of classical art and mythology, there are quite a few features that are almost instantly recognizable. A heavily muscled and semi-nude physique, a copious amount of facial hair, and a large club. The resemblance to a certain strongman in Greek mythology is uncanny, as the bodyguard appears to be an incarnation of the demigod Heracles. The transformation of Heracles from a body drunk, or a dim-witted brute in the more negative portrayals, into a protector figure for the tranquil Buddha seems almost too unbelievable. But how did this happen? Heracles was always a popular hero in the Greek tradition, and in many ways was directly associated with the East. As a trailblazer and world traveler, the demigod is said to have reached the lands of Bactria in India, and even ruled parts of it. As we have seen, Greek colonists brought with them the cults of the Olympic pantheon, and this included Heracles as well. In context to Greco-Bactria and the early Indo-Greeks, Heracles was likely the patron deity of the Euthydemed house, emblazoned upon the coins of both Euthydemus I and Demetrius I, but also later Indo-Greek rulers like Menander I and Lysias I. Alexander the Argead claimed descent from Heracles, and the use of this imagery may be a deliberate callback. It is fitting that Heracles occupies the reverse side of Demetrius' famous elephant-scalp tetradrachms, one Greek conqueror of India paralleling the other. A bronze statuette of Heracles, posed in a similar manner as the images on Euthydemus's coins, has been discovered in Ai-Khanoum. Such royal associations could also be because Heracles was formerly a superhuman before achieving godhood upon his death after accomplishing his 12 labors, and it resonated with the concept of apotheosis, a common idea shared among Hellenistic monarchs who believed that they could become divine upon their deaths. He was also popular among Hellenistic Iranian rulers as well, most famously exemplified by the dramatic reliefs at Mount Nemrut, where King Antiochus of Commagene shakes the hand of Heracles. Clearly there was no shortage of examples related to the itinerant strongman, and the imagery and power of a conquering hero would appeal to highly militarized societies and kings who waged war near constantly. Buddhism generally does not carry such connotations in its belief structure, so Heracles seems like a slightly unorthodox choice. But the adoption of Heracles did not occur in a vacuum, and he was conveniently co-opted into Buddhist mythology thanks to the existence of bodhisattvas. Essentially translating to persons on the path of awakening, bodhisattvas are beings that have come close to attaining enlightenment, but remain transfixed to the mortal realm to serve as avatars of virtues or stages of Mahayana Buddhism. Each bodhisattva usually carries some sort of striking or exaggerated visual motif, in contrast to the relatively simple asceticism of the Buddha himself. One of these is a figure named Vajrapani. In earlier instances, Vajrapani was a yaksha, a fierce nature spirit that was eventually persuaded to become a member of the Buddha's cadre, and eventually his bodyguard. To defend the Buddha against any possible threats, he wields the Vajra, a thunderbolt weapon that was previously associated with the Vedic Indra. It becomes clear that there are a large number of parallels between Vajrapani and Heracles that would lend to the association between the two. Both enforce order using their strength and martial prowess against demons and monsters who would seek to corrupt or destroy. Each achieves a sort of redemption in their stories, with Heracles undertaking the 12 labors to cleanse himself of the madness-induced murder of his family before ascending to godhood, and Vajrapani forsaking his wild and malicious history as a yaksha to walk the path to enlightenment by smiting the enemies of the Buddha. Through his association with Hellenistic monarchy, Heracles invokes royal power, while Vajrapani achieves a similar position by representing the power of the teachings of the Buddha, who was often depicted using royal imagery. Since Gandhara served as the seat of the Indo-Greek kings, it is logical that the later Buddhist patrons and artists of the region would find Heracles to be an attractive figure to adapt for their own purposes. What did Heracles Vajrapani look like? Heracles himself has a couple different incarnations in the Greek world, so it is not surprising that the Gandharan artists were not always consistent with their presentation, but generally speaking it is quite easy to identify those characteristics. Most of the time, Heracles Vajrapani has a full beard, but clean-shaven versions have also been found. Alexander famously minted coins with a beardless and youthful Heracles. Heracles' iconic weapon is what we typically think of a club, a piece of wood that gradually gets wider from the handle to the club head. The Vajra, by contrast, is usually held in the middle, with 2 oblong ends. Gradually, the Vajra loses its thunderbolt origin and becomes a bludgeoning weapon. In addition to his club, we often see the realistic depiction of his heavily muscular body, sometimes completely nude in Hellenistic fashion, but also carrying his iconic cloak, fashioned from the remains of the Nemean lion. As Buddhism spread throughout East Asia, so too did Heracles Vajrapani. Heracles was no longer viewed as the Greek demigod, but many of his more Hellenic traits may have continued to manifest. In China, Vajrapani was depicted wearing Heracles' cloak, though the skin of the Nemean lion was replaced with that of a regionally appropriate tiger, becoming a popular tomb guardian during the Tang period. It is also quite possible that these tiger warriors may actually just be artistic renderings of equipment used by Sui and Tang soldiers, much like the animal-themed headgear worn by Roman aquilifers, as famously depicted on Trajan's column. But the presence of the club in conjunction with the tiger or lion cloak is quite the coincidence. Buddhist temples in Japan often have their doorways flanked by a pair of large, intimidating guardian figures known as Neo, yet another incarnation of the Vajrapani. They still possess the exaggerated musculature of Heracles, and even with some of the stylized poses, but they are distinctively more East Asian in design and characteristics. With cults also found in Roman Britain, Heracles lives up to his reputation as a world traveler, spanning the entire breadth of Eurasia. While that is not to say that Heracles was worshipped as such in India, China, or Japan, many of the Greco-Roman elements persisted in a Buddhist medium and through various levels of syncretism. Perhaps even more so than Heracles, the god Dionysus became greatly associated with India, especially after the campaigns of Alexander, who chose him as a principal deity to venerate. Alexander's companions were said to have held Dionysian parties in honor of the god upon seeing the presence of ivy at the city of Nisa in modern Jalalabad. While he rarely appeared on coins, he was likely worshipped among the Greco-Bactrians and Indo-Greeks as well. A later source suggests that a temple of Dionysus was established at Nisa that was still being attended to in the mid-1st century AD. In Gandhara, Dionysiac scenes often served as a common subject matter to depict, especially on wall friezes, the so-called toilet trays, and metalwork. But what makes something Dionysiac? As the god of wine, drinking and revelry usually is the main theme of the work. The figures in these scenes are often dressed in Greek or Roman costume, drinking amphorae and bowls like the crater. Acrobats, dancers, and musicians play trumpets and cymbals in ecstatic rites. Satyrs, plump half-men, half-goats renowned for their alcoholic tendencies and lecherous nature, appear in significant numbers. Border scrolls decorated the background and edges, using vines and bunches of grapes to emphasize the befuddling atmosphere. It may seem contradictory for Buddhism, famous for its adherence to ascetic and minimalist lifestyles, to decorate temple images that celebrate more earthly pleasures like debauchery, excess, and gluttony, or to celebrate a cult of a Greek god. But in the context of Gandharan art, these Dionysiac scenes need not be interpreted as a veneration of Dionysus, but instead the joyous festivities that Dionysian scenes are intended to represent. In many occasions, these renderings would have been placed at the base of the stairs leading up to the stupa that housed the holy relics. In some sense, this can symbolize the jubilation of the journey of enlightenment, or rather, the happiness that was the byproduct of enlightenment. There are also similar parallels in Indian art, depictions of yakshas cavorting and drinking in dynamic poses, so the association is quite understandable. The Indo-Greek rulers almost certainly possessed a Greco-Macedonian drinking culture, and the royal connotations of such festivities and their connection to Dionysus was likely recognized by Gandharan patrons who wished to repurpose it for the Buddha. Heracles and Dionysus could be appropriated to tell stories that were markedly Indian in character, but the artists of Gandhara were also willing to incorporate various other mythological creatures. Hippocampi, Nereids, and ichthyocentaurs all appear as decorative elements. Instead of holding up the globe, the Titan Atlas is often shown holding up 3 celestial wheels to represent the Buddha in the past, present, and future. One of the most fascinating reliefs to be ever discovered in Gandhara, specifically at the site of Charsada, currently housed in the British Museum, is a scene from some sort of story. The sculpture in question shows 3 men, dressed in Greco-Roman clothing, while an accompanying woman, who is more Indian in pose and costume, raises her arms above her head, watching in alarm as these men pull an effigy of a horse on wheels into the nearby city gates. By any measure, this is almost certainly a scene from the Trojan cycle, perhaps an Indian Cassandra vainly warning her countrymen of the duplicity of the Achaeans, who have hidden inside the Trojan horse. In my opinion, this is strong evidence that Gandharan sculptors and patrons did not just borrow designs from art that they imported from trade with Rome, but were actively aware of the stories they were borrowing from, in this case the work of Homer, and it was likely a consequence of centuries of Greek rule. Hi there, you're listening to the Hellenistic Age Podcast, Episode 79, The Indo-Greeks, Homer on the Indus. Whether he was a great conqueror or Buddhist saint, the death of Menander I Soter in approximately 130 BC marked a turning point for the Indo-Greeks, both in terms of their overall strength and our ability to give a coherent reconstruction of its history. Menander is the final Indo-Greek ruler, chronologically speaking, to be mentioned in any Greco-Roman text, and yet there are over 20 additional kings and queens that ruled for another 140 years, and almost all of them are only attested to by their coins. Indian sources and epigraphy are little better, and are still subject to intense scrutiny. Outside of broad strokes and individual snapshots, attempting to reconcile the various competing theories would be an exercise in futility. But we can give a general approximation of the events that transpired between the 2nd century BC and the 2nd century AD, not only to document the decline and fall of the Indo-Greek kingdoms, but also witness the development of Indo-Roman trade, and assess the legacy of Hellenistic rule in Central and South Asia, as new kingdoms and empires followed after. Upon his death, Menander was likely succeeded by a ruling pair, a king named Strato I and a woman named Agathoclea, along with another figure named Zoilos I. This queen is unusual compared to her predecessors, a lack of evidence of royal women notwithstanding. Unlike Laodike, the mysterious woman who was found sharing the obverse side of a Eucratidid coin with a man named Heliocles, Agathoclea not only is depicted alongside Strato, but also minted coins bearing her own portrait, along with the title Basilises Theotropou Agathocleas, of the godlike queen Agathoclea. It is likely that Agathoclea was the wife of Menander and the mother of Strato, probably acting as a queen regent. The Karakhti inscriptions on these coins always associate her with Strato. She appears to have been a powerful figure, but not much else can be determined beyond this extent. What can be ascertained is that Menander's kingdom was divided upon his death, either on purpose, if Menander had multiple heirs and wished to allot a separate administrative region to them, or due to civil war. Several kings were now simultaneously occupying positions in Gandhara, the Swat Taxila, Parapamisidai, the Hindu Kush, Arachosia, Kabul, and the Punjab. These figures appear to have competed and cooperated to varying degrees, but little is known outside of numismatic evidence, and to attempt to untangle this geographical and chronological web would be beyond the means of this project. What information do we have that can give us a general idea of the political situation of the Indo-Greek kingdoms at this time? The Heliodorus pillar confirms that Antialcidas I ruled in Taxila just before the end of the 2nd century, and made attempts to forge an alliance with King Kashiputra of Besnagar. We also know that he minted coins that display an iconographic blend of the Olympian Zeus and the Hindu Indra, and the envoy Heliodorus makes a very specific reference to the veneration of Vasudeva Krishna. It is very possible that Antialcidas was trying to gather the support of the Indian population and kingdoms to bolster his rule, perhaps due to a sense of political isolation, or even competition with the other Indo-Greek rulers. Antialcidas is also the only other Indo-Greek king, besides Menander, to be mentioned by an Indian source, so we are left in the dark about the movements of the other Hellenes. What is important to understand regarding the fate of the Indo-Greeks were the events that had taken place in the West. At about the same time as Menander's death, the last Greco-Bactrian king, Heliocles, had been overthrown or died, and from then on Bactria would belong to the nomadic tribes of the steppe, known as the Uashi. But the Uashi were not the only peoples to have traveled down through Central Asia. Their movement from the Tarim Basin caused them to clash with another group called the Saka, a generic term used by the Persians to refer to any of the nomads that the Greeks would have called Scythian, or the Indian Shakas. The Saka were pushed into Bactria, perhaps being the responsible party for the destruction of the Greco-Bactrian city at Ai-Khanum, but they did not remain idle for long. It appears that they moved west directly towards the Parthian Empire, first battling Mithridates I and his son Phraates II. Since the Parthians were already trying to deal with attacks by the Seleucids, this incursion caused a major crisis on Parthia's eastern border. At least one Parthian king was said to have been killed in battle against the Saka, and it was not until Mithridates II that they were finally driven out around 120 BC. With expansion into the Iranian plateau no longer an option, the Saka decided to turn back to the east. As far as we can tell, they did not challenge the Ueshi, but instead decided to set their sights on the now divided Indo-Greek kingdoms. By roughly the year 85, a Saka chieftain named Mawes, or Moga, led an invasion into Gandhara, attacking and toppling the then-ruling Indo-Greek king Archebios, and established the so-called Indo-Scythian or Indo-Saka kingdom, with Takshila as its capital. Dating this event is difficult, for although a dedication from the city demonstrates that there was a Maoist era, there is little context to give us any sense of chronology, which makes it an ambiguous piece of evidence to rely on. We know that he minted coins at Takshila that were inspired by his Greek predecessors, though he and other early Saka kings did not let themselves be portrayed with a side profile or bust. Despite his nomadic origins, Mawes appears to have integrated himself neatly into the pre-existing Greek framework. A unique coin minted by the Indo-Greek king Artemidoros, who ruled within the lifetime of Mawes, hints at a connection with the Saka king. In some readings, the Karashthi legend can be interpreted as Artemidoros, son of the king of kings Mawes, which would seem to suggest that Mawes' children were either of mixed Saka Greek descent or had taken on a Greek name. Evidence for Saka Greek marriages might be found in the coins of a queen known as Makene, a royal lady presumed to be of a Greek background who oversaw joint issues between herself and Mawes, perhaps an indication of a matrimonial bond. However, issues regarding the syntax of the Karashthi legend on Artemidoros' coins have complicated its interpretation regarding the relationship between this Indo-Greek king and Mawes, as it could imply that Artemidoros was either a subordinate official, a joint king, or even an adopted son. Either way, the Saka ruler does not appear to have meddled much with the pre-existing structure of Hellenistic Gandhara. But while the Saka may have enjoyed their dominion over Takshila, the other Indo-Greeks do not seem to have taken their presence too kindly. Following the death of Mawes in roughly 60 BC, the Indo-Greek Apollodotus II likely recaptured Takshila, evidenced by his overstriking of Mawes' coins and his use of the title Megas, perhaps a challenge to the Saka chieftain's use of the title King of Kings. This resurgence was a brief event, however, and soon the Greeks again faced a nomadic attack from another Saka king named Azes. Like with Mawes, there appears to have been an Azes era as well, this time dated to around 57 to 56 BC, which is taken to be the start of his reign in Takshila. Unfortunately, scholars are divided on whether there are two Azes or just one, but we at least know that Azes followed Apollodotus since the former overstruck the coins of the latter. The Chinese may also have something to say about the final days of the Indo-Greeks. According to the Han Shu, two diplomatic parties were sent out by the emperors Wudi and Yuandi to a land known as Jibin. Though Shendu, the term used by Zhang Chen to refer to India, is not mentioned, it is presumed that Jibin is referring to the area of Peshawar and parts of Gandhara. In the early 1st century BC, Wudi sought to contact the king of Jibin, known as Wutolao, who reportedly murdered the envoys that arrived at his court, allegedly on the basis that the emperor was too far away to pose any serious threat. About 40 years later in the reign of Yuandi, a circa 48 to 33 BC, Wutolao's son sent his own mission with gifts back to China, attempting to apologize for the actions of his father. When a general of the Han named Wen Zhong oversaw the escort of the officials back to their homeland, he too was nearly murdered by the Jibin king, but he managed to escape and seek refuge in the court of a rival prince, Yin Mofu, in the neighboring city known as Rongchu. Both Wen Zhong and Yin Mofu became allies, attacking and overthrowing the Jibin king, and the Chinese envoy helped place the Rongchu prince on the throne, who was given an official seal of recognition and submission on behalf of the emperor. This is a complex tale, and early scholars like W. Tarn were initially inclined to think that Yinmofu was an Indo-Greek king named Hermaios, believing that the city of Rongchu was a transliteration of the word Yonaki, city of the Greeks. Following this line of reasoning, Wutolao might also be a rendering of the Greek term for king, Basileou. But Hermaios no longer is thought to have ruled during the time of Yuandi, and while the identity of these figures of Jibin are virtually impossible to identify, The Hanshu gives interesting tidbits of information that describe the area during this time. According to the reports, the kings of Gibeon made gold and silver coins that had portraits of the king on one side and an image of the king riding a horse on the other. This description exactly matches the coins of the Indo-Scythians, specifically Azes and his successor Azelices, who minted designs showing themselves on top of a stallion, as befitting their nomadic heritage. And Azes ruled Takshila at about the same time as Yuan Di struck terms with Gibeon. The dominance of non-Greek figures like Mawes and Azes symbolize the waning power of the Indo-Greek kingdoms, and this is also reflected by their coinage. True, Indian mints continued to produce high-quality specie for quite some time after Menander, but there is a noticeable drop by the early to mid-1st century BC. While the portraits of the Bactrian kings are considered some of the most beautiful and lifelike to ever be produced, the skill of the die cutters diminishes following Apollodorus' reign. Finer detail gives way to cruder and blockier designs, and the lettering becomes more prone to error. A debasement of the silver content of these coins is quite noticeable, as later Indo-Greek rulers would issue smaller and smaller denominations to compensate for the lack of purity. There is the double decadrachm of Amyntas, the largest silver coin from the ancient world ever discovered, but it remains an extreme exception. Such a reduction in quality was very likely a consequence of local silver mines drying up, and due to other sources like the Badakhshan Mountains in Bactria becoming increasingly more difficult to access as it was further occupied by the nomads. Based on the location of the coin finds and their monograms, it is evident that the final Greek rulers occupied the eastern Punjab. The surrounding areas had been taken over by the Indo-Saka successors of Azelices, generally known as the Kshatrapas, an Indian rendition of the Persian term satrap, who were divided into a northern and western dynasty. Of the most important northern Kshatrapas was Rajuvula, who was able to proclaim himself king at Mathura in the first decade of the new millennium, as demonstrated by a sandstone lion capital erected in his name. Most scholars agree that the final Indo-Greek king was named Strato, though they are split as to whether it was Strato II or Strato III who held the unfortunate distinction. While the traditional ending date of the Hellenistic period is typically accepted with the death of Cleopatra VII of Egypt, it might very well be the case that the last independent Greek heirs of Alexander and the successors were these rulers of the Punjab, outlasting the Ptolemaic dynasty by another 40 years. Regardless, Rajuvula is believed to have overthrown the last Strato by 10 AD, as he imitated the latter's coins and extended his reach into the Punjab. It is also quite apparent that local Indian polities, namely the rulers of Jammu and the Kashmir, were also involved to some extent or another. This is evidenced by the coins of the last Indo-Greek kings adopting local Indian emblems, such as a trident battle axe, which would either indicate that they were politically tied to the Jammu rulers, or the Jammu minted imitation coins themselves, and had seized whatever vestigial territory was left of the crumbling Greek kingdom. The coins of Strato II are perfect representations of the Indo-Greeks at this time, with the likeness of an extremely aged and sunken-cheeked man paired with almost indecipherable Greek lettering and rough-hewn images of Athena Alkadimos, a pale imitation of those minted by the likes of Menander or the other Bactrian kings. After almost 200 years since Demetrius' invasion, and 300 after the death of Alexander the Great, Greek rule would decisively come to an end in India, not with a bang, but a whimper. With the death of Strato in the first decade of the new millennium, the history of the Indo-Greeks has come to an end. But let us push on forward, as it is still relevant for the rest of our discussion. Though the Indo-Scythians had overseen the collapse or absorption of the Greek kingdoms, they too would quickly fold as they themselves faced outside attacks. In roughly 20 AD, a new figure emerges from the coin records, a ruler known as Gondophares, who controlled much of the Indus Valley as king of Takshila until approximately 45. His name is unusual, as it is Parthian in origin, rather than that of Saka. He is the first of the so-called Indo-Parthian rulers, though how he or his kingdom were connected to the Parthian Empire is not entirely clear, since he appears to have been ruling in parallel with the kings in the west. He possibly could have been a breakaway figure, perhaps a disgruntled or independent princeling looking to stake his own claim, or it could have been the case of joint kingship and coordination across vast territories. The Indo-Parthians are almost unknown beyond their coins, but there are a few Western accounts that provide further information. The author of the Periplus, written around the time of Gundophares' death, confirms that the Indo-Parthians were engaged in frequent civil wars, and few remained on the throne for long. Contrasting with the mercantile text of the Periplus is the New Testament Apocrypha, known as the Acts of St. Thomas. Though it is purported to be written by an unknown Syriac author some 2 centuries later, the work describes the travels of the Christian apostle St. Thomas, who famously journeyed to India to proselytize in the middle of the 1st century AD. Its religious connotations and later composition should rightly lead one to hesitate in accepting it at face value, but there are several accurate observations regarding India at the time. According to the Chronicle, Thomas ended up at the court of an Indian king named Gundophares, where he served as a carpenter and spiritual advisor, whose great deeds compelled both the king and many of his subjects to undergo a conversion to Christianity. Obviously, Gundophares must be the same as the Indo-Parthian ruler, Gundophares, though whether he actually adopted or patronized Christianity is entirely speculative. It is perhaps because of the instability brought about by Gundophares' death that the Indo-Parthian kingdom quickly declined and fell apart, shortly before the end of the 1st century. Precipitating this collapse would be yet another group of migrating nomads, the Yuezhi, or, more specifically, the Kushans. We briefly touched upon the origins of the Yuezhi in our discussion on the arrival of the Chinese into Central Asia, but it is worth exploring a little more. According to our Chinese sources, the Yuezhi were originally a powerful nomadic confederation living at the eastern end of the Tarim Basin. In contrast to other nomadic groups like the Saka, who were of Indo-Iranian origin, or the Xiongnu, who perhaps spoke some sort of Proto-Turkic or Proto-Mongolian language, the Yuezhi are believed to have been descendants of an Indo-European language group, generally referred to as the Tocharians. Whether they continue to speak Tocharian at this point, or whether we can so easily identify them as Tocharians at all, remains contentious but irrelevant at the present. As we can recall, the Yuezhi had been pushed from the Tarim Basin in the early mid-2nd century BC, due to the expansion of the Xiongnu Empire, and clashes with other tribes like the Wu Sun pushed them into Central Asia, thereby driving out the previously established Saka. Greek authors like Strabo identify the Tocharians, or Tokharoi, as one of the main nomadic tribes to seize Bactria from the Greeks, and variations of the word Tocharian were used by the likes of the Persians and Tibetans to refer to the Yuezhi. As reported by Zhang Chen, the Yuezhi did not directly control all of Bactria as of 128 BC, mainly occupying the regions north of the Amu Darya River, but it appears that the cities of southern Bactria were vassals or tributary states of some kind. The Yuezhi reportedly numbered upwards of 500,000, and were said to possess a formidable fighting force of nearly 200,000 warriors. While they would always retain aspects of their nomadic heritage, it appears that the Kushans were quickly acculturating themselves to the sedentary population that they now ruled over, such as minting imitation coins of the previous Greco-Bactrian and Indo-Greek kings. We have little information about what the Yuezhi were doing throughout the late 2nd and early 1st centuries, though we have an explanation from the Hanshu that the Yuezhi had divided themselves into 5 princedoms, Yabgu, by 40 BC. Of these Yabgus, the most important to us are the Guishuang, the Kushans. Why they had divided is unclear, but soon a prominent prince among the Kushan, Kujula Kadphises, had risen to power in the middle of the 1st century AD. According to an inscription from the site of Takht-i-Bahi, Kujula was originally a vassal or a prince at the court of Gundophares, but he soon managed to reunite the Yuezhi under his banner, establishing the mighty Kushan Empire. Besides the Chinese accounts which speak of this event, we are thankfully given collaborating information. The contemporary author of the Periplus noted that the warlike Bactrians were under a single king, and the later Kushan rulers themselves honored Kujula as the founding dynast. Following his death in roughly 80 AD, Kujula's successors embarked on a series of conquests that would expand their reach from Bactria through Gandhara and India as far as the upper Ganges, but also northwards into parts of Sogdiana and Fergana, with tributary states in the Tarim Basin and the lower Ganges. The most important and famous of these successors would be Kanishka I, or Kanishka the Great, Kujula's great-grandson who ruled from approximately 127 to 150, the height of Kushan power. Kanishka was renowned in much the same manner as Ashoka and Menander, honored in Buddhist sources as a generous patron and convert, but he and the other Kushans were dynamic rulers, capable of employing a wide array of imagery that reflected both their nomadic origins and the cosmopolitan nature of their empire. Bactrian, Indian, Buddhist, and even Greek. The Kushan appeared to have been politically stable and oversaw a time of general prosperity, fueled by a desire for trade and exchange within the various states of Eurasia. It is in the reign of Kanishka where we will halt our narrative of the former Hellenistic Far East, and let us return to the Mediterranean world to see what developments have occurred in the interim. While Greek rule in India had definitively come to an end in the new millennium, the Hellenistic kingdoms of the Mediterranean had disappeared almost a half-century before. The Seleucids, the Ptolemies, and the Antigonids were all swallowed up by the growing power of the Roman Empire by 30 BC, then ruled by Augustus Caesar. The Parthians had taken away the former Seleucid holdings in Mesopotamia and the Iranian plateau, and the Kushans now ruled over what was Greco-Bactria and the Indo-Greek Kingdoms. Further still was the Chinese Han Empire, and the various dynastic kingdoms of India and Sri Lanka, like Satvahana and Cholas. For the first time in centuries, a degree of relative stability was experienced by much of the Eurasian landmass, an era marked by increased connectivity, mainly economic, between the various empires from the Mediterranean to China. This is generally thought of as the First Silk Routes period, a concept used to describe the period between 1st century BC to the 3rd century AD. As was the case with my discussion of Han China in the West, was there truly a Silk Road? Almost certainly not. It is clear that those like the Chinese and Romans probably knew almost nothing about each other, and their interaction was punctuated by only 1 or 2 direct encounters. Still, the degree of economic exchange that took place was on a scale that was not rivaled again until the medieval period. For the Roman Empire, most of their foreign mercantile activities took place through maritime adventures. The conquest of the Iranian plateau by the Parthians had severed the direct land routes between the Mediterranean and India during the mid-2nd century. This had an adverse effect on the trade networks of the Hellenistic world, as the Hellenistic kings and later Roman officials were hesitant on enriching their Parthian neighbors through tariffs and customs for Eastern goods. The Chinese were acutely aware of this problem, who spoke of how the Parthians were not keen on letting the Romans get in direct contact with the Chinese government so they could remain the key middlemen in the silk trade. By the late 2nd century, though, the Ptolemies were able to find a solution to the problem by turning to naval expeditions instead. While the Red Sea and even the Persian Gulf had been extensively incorporated into the maritime network of the Hellenistic world, sailing to India has always been problematic. The Greeks were unaware of the monsoon winds that could seriously hamper travel in the Indian Ocean, as what happened when Alexander's commander Nearchus attempted to sail down the Indus back to the Persian Gulf in 324. It appears that Seleucid sailors were not privy to this information either. According to Strabo, a shipwrecked sailor from India was rescued by the Ptolemaic coast guard along the Red Sea during the reign of Ptolemy VIII Physcon. After being brought back to Alexandria and taught Greek, the Indian traveler was hired as a navigator to guide a naval expedition led by a man named Eudoxus of Cyzicus, a skilled explorer of the Nile River. Thanks to the knowledge of the Indian, Eudoxus earned the distinction of being the first known Greek to exploit the monsoon winds and make a round trip from India. Other sources suggest that the credit should go to Hippalus, another Greek sailor that may or may not have been a subordinate of Eudoxus, and the western monsoon would be known thereafter as the Hippolytan winds. As an interesting aside, there is a curious reference regarding the final days of the Ptolemaic dynasty in India. According to authors like Cassius Dio and Plutarch, Cleopatra VII planned an escape for herself and for her son, Caesarion, after the disaster at Actium, by sailing through the Red Sea and into the Indian Ocean. From there, they would have either disembarked in Parthian territory, or, more likely, in India. The plan never came to fruition though, as an attack by Nabatean raiders burned the ships that were prepared to take them. If we are to believe that India was their ultimate destination, I cannot help but wonder if Cleopatra was looking to escape to the last independent Hellenistic kingdom outside of Roman or Parthian control, the Indo-Greek Kingdoms of Zoilos II and or Apollophanes I. But it seems that the Ptolemies did not exploit this newfound knowledge to its full benefit. However, the Roman desire for trade along the Indian Ocean was fueled by a much larger population of wealthy aristocrats and later emperors, with insatiable demands for goods like spices, gemstones, pearls, and, vis-a-vis the Indian connection with China, bolts of silk. Less than a few years after the conquest of Egypt, the scale of trade between the Roman-controlled Mediterranean and India spiked dramatically. According to Strabo, the number of ships heading between the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean went from 20 per year under the Ptolemies to over 120 during Augustus's reign. Because the government could place a quarter tax on all goods coming into the harbors of Alexandria and the Red Sea from India, they were able to gain extraordinary revenues. Over 250 million sesterces would be deposited each year into imperial coffers by the mid-1st century AD, out of a total value of 1 billion. Upwards of 1/4 to 1/3 of the annual revenues were brought into the Roman Empire this way. For those like Pliny the Elder, a member of the senior staff of the Emperor Vespasian, there were serious consequences due to trade with India. Regardless of the moralizing about the excessive consumption of luxuries, he was astute in his observations. Foreign goods like spices, silk, and frankincense were all renewable resources. Precious metals like gold and silver, brought by Roman traders to the east to purchase these items from locals, were not. There was an uncomfortable realization that the finite Roman supply of bullion was dwindling, being carried out of the local economy and into foreign markets, where they would often be melted down for local use. Such a situation was not suitable for the long term. Pliny reports that upwards of 100 million sesterces was leaving the empire with each year, and the gold and silver mines would not last forever. A preponderance of literary evidence gives us a better insight into the wants and fears of the Roman consumer during this period, but there is clear evidence of Roman exports beyond their bullion evident in the Kushan Empire in India. Nothing encapsulates the diverse tastes of the Kushan elite than the Bagram hoard, a large deposit of treasures found at the former Kushan capital of Bagram in Afghanistan. The contents of this collection date roughly to the 1st or 2nd centuries AD, but reflect the Kushan's cosmopolitan taste for luxury goods, with items such as Roman glassware and bronze statues, along with carved Indian ivories and Chinese lacquer. How much did the Mediterranean world know about the Greek kings in Bactria and India? As no doubt I have hammered into your head at this point, the scarcity of writings on the Greco-Bactrians and Indo-Greeks are an unfortunate fact of life. We have seen clear evidence of Hellenistic intellectual culture, as per the Sophitos inscription in Arachosia or the Maxims of Delphi in Iconography. But if there were any written histories or panegyrics glorifying the deed of the many kings, we have no record of them. Echoes of knowledge about the Greek rulers of Bactria and India clearly passed into the writings of later Greeks and Romans, however, and I think it is worth investigating. One of the most important Hellenistic sources for affairs in Central Asia comes from the work of Apollodorus, a Greek historian of the 1st century BC who chronicled the history of the Parthian Empire in his Parthica. He was from the city of Artemita in modern Iraq, then ruled by the Parthians. and it was possible that he was able to draw his findings from either nearby Seleucia on the Tigris or relied on Parthian sources and traditions. The Parthica has since been lost, but authors like Strabo and Justin directly cite his work. While the focus is on the eponymous Parthians, Apollodorus chronicled the history of the Greco-Bactrians, and possibly the Indo-Greeks as well, since he admiringly spoke of Menander, and clearly he viewed them as integral to the story of the Arsacid dynasty. Later Roman authors who cited Apollodorus' work were more interested about the Parthians, the great imperial rival of Rome for 300 years, rather than the Greeks of Bactria in India, and so surviving experts on that matter are considerably thin. Another important author relating to Central Asia was Isidore of Charax's Parthian Stations. Like with Apollodorus, Isidore was a Greek living under Parthian control around the turn of the 1st century in the city of Charax-Spasinu, a former Seleucid site on the northern mouth of the Persian Gulf that later became the capital of the kingdom of Karakene. At this point, Karakene was a vassal state of the Parthians, but Isidore wrote an itinerary of the major land routes of the Parthian Empire, providing distances between cities and supply stations, perhaps intended as a guide for a Roman invasion of Parthia. The Parthian Stations was written contemporary to the final days of the Indo-Greeks, and Isidore describes the roads leading to the cities of India like Alexandria and Arachosia and the kingdom of the Indo-Saka. Alexandria and Arachosia, likely Kandahar, is still described as the bustling metropolis of the region, and he also mentions the city of Demetrius, otherwise unknown to us, but presumed to be a settlement founded by the Indo-Greeks following the initial invasion over the Hindu Kush. Isidore also seems to have composed a history of the Parthians, but it does not survive, and it is unknown if he ever talked about the Greco-Bactrians. Moving away from the Parthians, our best source of knowledge on Indo-Roman trade comes from the sailing manual known as the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. Written in Greek by an anonymous Roman during the mid to late 1st century AD, the Periplus is an itinerary of the maritime routes of anyone journeying from Alexandrian Egypt to the Indian Ocean. Similar in style to the Parthian Stations, it was likely an eyewitness account of a merchant. All the major trading posts en route to India are described in detail, including a list of all exports and imports tied to each region. One major hub was Barigaza, the site of modern Baruch, situated along the coast of the Gulf of Kambat in modern Gujarat. It was an extremely important trading port for the Indo-Saka, and Roman traders would visit to sell goods like wine and coral in return for gemstones and cotton, among other products. Beyond providing the economic picture of the region, our anonymous source gives a couple interesting tidbits of information relating to the Indo-Greeks. Quote, "In the area there are still preserved to this very day signs of Alexander's expedition, ancient shrines and the foundations of encampments and huge wells. There are found on the market in Barigaza even today old drachmas engraved with the inscriptions, in Greek letters, of Apollodotus and Menander, rulers who came after Alexander." End quote. Obviously, the attribution of these ruins to Alexander is incorrect. The Macedonian king never made it out of the Punjab. But if the merchant was able to correctly recognize these fortifications as being Greek in style, then he is probably referring to the later Indo-Greek campaigns. Both comments seem to imply that the author is either well-read or was provided information by others in the area. But it is hard to tell how familiar he was with the Indo-Greeks. Coins of Indo-Greek and Indo-Saka rulers have been found as far as Britain, but it is likely that these were not actually used by any of the traders as coin money in the strictest sense, and were probably relied more for their bulk silver content. One of the most bizarre yet interesting stories we have comes from the Athenian sophist Flavius Philostratus. Writing in the late 2nd to early 3rd century AD, he composed a biography on a Pythagorean teacher of the mid-1st century AD named Apollonius of Tyana. According to the tale, Apollonius was something of a wanderer, his travels taking him down to the furthest reaches of the known world. Among his destinations was the city of Taxila, whose leader received Apollonius as an honored guest and engaged in philosophical debates with him. The work gives a detailed account of Taxila, which Apollonius describes as being as large as Assyrian Nineveh and organized in the manner of a Greek settlement, commenting on the many temples and works of art in the city that have evoked the memories of Alexander the Great and his battle with Porus. Philostratus claims that the main source on this matter were the notebooks of Apollonius's disciple, Damis. Naturally, this has attracted suspicion from modern scholars, who doubt the existence of Damis' writings and assert that Apollonius' itinerary is heavily embellished to exaggerate his importance, and the assertion of Greek elements in Takshila are intended to diminish its Indianness. Despite the strange circumstances of the biography, there are interesting details to the story that line up with the organization of northwestern India. According to Philostratus, the ruling prince of Takshila who hosted Apollonius was named Phraortes. The name seems to be Parthian in origin, and the region would have been dominated by Indo-Parthians at this time period. Takshila at this time was also not just a single city, as the Indo-Greeks established a sister site at Sirkap that was more structured like a typical Hellenistic city, and the extra amenities like frescoes or altars to Alexander would make more sense if it were a former Indo-Greek settlement. While it appears that certain elements of the story were drawn from older sources like Megasthenes Indica or even Ctesias, Philostratus likely used a well-informed yet unknown account dating to the 1st century AD. How much we can take the story as fact remains to be seen. The appearances of the Bactrian and Indo-Greek kings in the literary traditions of the Greco-Roman world are far and few in between, but we might find them in the most unexpected of places. In the 14th century, the medieval English poet Geoffrey Chaucer makes a curious reference in his The Knight's Tale, one of the stories of his Canterbury Tales. Among the many classically inspired figures in the Great Tourney, a certain warrior can be found that is described as follows, quote, "With Archite, as we find in histories, came riding, god of arms, the great Emetrius, king of India, upon a bay steed. Its trappings were of steel, and it was covered with cloth of gold patterned skillfully. His coat of arms was a cloth of Tartary, set with pearls that were white and smooth and large. His saddle was of burnished gold newly hammered. A short mantle hanging upon his shoulders was brimful of rubies, sparkling like fire. His curly hair was clustered in ringlets. It was yellow and glittered like the sun." End quote. The description of an Indian king sharing European features, along with the similarity of the names Emetrius and Demetrius, is almost certainly a reference to the famed Euthydemic conqueror of the same name. Still, one cannot help but wonder where exactly Chaucer picked this information up from. Was it from Strabo or Justin? Perhaps an account that was known in the Middle Ages but lost to us? Either way, it remains a mystery. For those like Strabo, Chaucer, and Tarn, the stories of the Greeks in Bactria and India captured the imagination of many. Romantic notions of Hellenic civilization flourishing in the furthest outposts of the ancient world led scholars to desperately search for evidence that would validate the authors of antiquity, scouring the Afghan countryside for the supposed 1,000 cities of the Greco-Bactrian kingdom, or looking through Indian literature for proof of Greek epics and philosophy being translated into Sanskrit. For much of the 20th century, piles of coins bearing the images and names of kings like Demetrius and Menander were the only significant pieces of evidence that the Greeks were there at all, despite occupying these lands for over 300 years. Alfred Fouché, the father of Gandharan studies and head of archaeological teams tasked with investigating the Greek cities of Afghanistan, expressed serious doubts about ever finding anything of substance, describing the fervor as a Bactrian mirage. Despite the pioneering work of W. Tarn, his reconstructions at the time stood on the flimsiest piles of evidence compared to the claims he makes, his tales of the Greco-Bactrian dynasties being more reminiscent of a soap opera than any serious attempt at historiography. With such poor presence in the archaeological record and with little to no evidence of Hellenic culture among the later communities of Central Asia and India, scholar A.K. Narayan's landmark text, the Indo-Greeks, argues that Menander and his contemporaries were but a blip in the history of India, quoting that the Greeks came, the Greeks saw, but India conquered. As we've discussed over these many episodes, these perceptions need to be radically reconsidered. Nearly 5 decades of archaeological research has dramatically changed our understanding of Hellenistic Central Asia and India, not only with major finds like the city of Ai-Khanoum, but also inscriptions and objects that, when paired with the ancient accounts, can help us assess the legacy and impact of Greek rule. One of the most notable trends that we see was the continued use of the Greek language and alphabet. As was the case with Egypt and the Near East, Greek became the administrative lingua franca for both Bactria and Gandhara well into the Kushan period. Positions like the Meridarchos and Strategos can be found throughout the first centuries BC and AD, and even the title of satrap, a holdover from Persian rule, has also been discovered. Kushan rulers until Kanishka routinely utilized the titles of Basileus, king, and Basileos Basileon, king of kings, including Greek epithets. Long before his identification, the fourth Kushan emperor Vima Takto was only known to numismatists as Soter Megas, great savior. Under their authority, the Bactrian language was codified into a written form for the first time, using the Greek alphabet as a base, though they added a few characters to compensate variations in sound. The Macedonian calendar, adapted from the Babylonian one following Alexander's conquests, also remained part of the administrative formula, as seen in Kharosthi inscriptions transliterating the Macedonian Panemos, June and July, into the Indian variation Panema. Derived from the Seleucid era, the Indo-Greek era inspired many similar dating systems in India thereafter, that of Mawis, Azes, and Kanishka. The Seleucid era itself continued to be used by Nestorian Christians as far as Kazakhstan and China in the 14th century AD. This linguistic survival may also have been noted by the Greco-Roman world as well, as we have records of Indian ambassadors visiting the court of the Emperor Augustus in the late 1st century BC. The biographer Suetonius tells us as much, though is somewhat vague, stating that envoys from, quote, the Indians and Scythians, nation only known to them by hearsay, had come to pay respects. It is quite possible that he's referring to representatives from the Indo-Saka, who would be ruling over Gandhara at this time. Strabo, relying on the testimony of a man who met another group of Indian ambassadors in Syria, gives us more detail. A group of Indian envoys journeyed to Rome in order to establish an alliance with Augustus on behalf of a king Porus, who provided Caesar with gifts as an incentive. Strabo's eyewitness makes it clear that he was able to understand the intentions of the Indians because they came with a letter, written in Greek on a leather strip. Certainly, the name of this Indian ruler who allegedly oversaw 600 subordinate kings is suspect, given the overt connection with the Porus who battled Alexander the Great. The mention of Greek writing is oddly specific though, and Strabo himself attests to seeing the gifts of these Indian ambassadors as described by his eyewitness, namely an armless Indian youth named Hermas. Another consistent feature of the story is the reference to leather skins being used as a writing material. Leather was used in tax documents on Greco-Bactria, and Zhang Chen noted that leather with horizontal writing was employed for record-keeping when he visited the area. These details add credibility to this story, and provides ample evidence that Greek continued to be used as a diplomatic language under the Indo-Saka, and possibly later. According to Philostratus, Apollonius was surprised when he visited Taxila, and was greeted with the fluent Greek of King Phraortes, who ruled during the Indo-Parthian period. Clearly then, Greek must have been utilized to a significant extent long after the Indo-Greek kingdoms fell. But there is a marked decline in its overall quality when seen in any official presentation, particularly on coins. We find that local engravers were beginning to introduce spelling errors into their work, without much need for correction. There was also a clear policy shift regarding its use during the height of Kushan rule. In 1993, members of the Mujahideen stumbled upon the remains of a Kushan-era temple outside of the small Afghan village of Rabatak. Inside was a large inscription, dedicated on behalf of Kanishka I to inaugurate his first regnal year, approximately 127-128 AD. While it has proven invaluable for providing a genealogy of Kushan rulers, it also provides key evidence as to the fate of the Greek language within Central Asia and India. One translation of the first few lines reads as follows, quote, "The great salvation, Kanishka the Kushan, the righteous, the just, the autocrat, the god, worthy of worship, who has obtained the kingship from Nana and from all the gods, who has inaugurated the year one as the gods pleased, and he issued a Greek edict, and then he put it into Aryan." End quote. In the context of this proclamation, Aryan refers to the Bactrian language, but Kanishka does not mean that he has made a bilingual version of an inscription in both Greek and Bactrian. He is explicitly saying that he is making a conscious effort to replace Greek with Bactrian, albeit Bactrian using the Greek alphabet, in all official capacities. This is evidenced by the overstriking of coins, swapping the names of Greek gods with Iranian or Indian ones, and the general decline of the Greek language. Given that the earliest Kushans were descended from Tocharian speakers, to declare the adoption of an Iranian language for administrative purposes so openly must have been a calculated political statement, likely aided by the decline or absorption of the Greek elite into Central Asia and India. Yet the use of Greek characters for Bactrian can be seen on the coins and administrative documents of the Turkic Shahi dynasty that ruled Kabul in the 8th century AD. Along with their language, so too did the Greeks bring their literature. The speculation of the transmission of Greek intellectual culture, be it in the form of plays, philosophy, or history, in Central and South Asia, has persisted in the minds of many classicists and Indologists alike, who have hunted through the great works of India to see if there was any evidence of its survival. Despite their best efforts, their search has turned up relatively for naught, and no known examples of Greco-Bactrian or Indo-Greek scholarship have survived in their complete form. Parallels can certainly be made between works like the Questions of King Milinda and the Letters of Pseudo-Aristaeus, or the Doctrine of the Buddha and that of Pyrrho of Elise, but in the absence of any concrete evidence, it becomes tempting to create connections when they aren't necessarily there. Similar ideas and structures could have arisen independently long before the Hellenistic period, and it may be too tempting to try and assume that one must have influenced the other in lieu of this time of close contact. Still, there is sufficient literary and archaeological evidence that hints at something more. For a long period of time, the writings of the Greco-Roman authors were all that scholars could rely upon for evidence of Hellenistic culture thriving in Bactria and India. In a speech regarding the importance of Homer, the 1st century orator Dio Chrysostom exclaimed that, quote, "It is said that Homer's poetry is sung even in India, where they have translated it into their own speech and tongue." End quote. This is quite a remarkable statement, and there are many possible conclusions we can draw from this. One is that Dio is exaggerating to illustrate his point. He was a philosopher and orator, not a historian. He does not provide the source for his claim, and considering he wrote it over 50 years since the end of the Indo-Greek Kingdoms, it may be hard to take at face value. However, the near-contemporary Aelian states the same thing. Plutarch is more colonialist in his estimation of Greek culture thriving in Asia, claiming that it was because of Alexander's conquests that the Gedrosians were chanting the verses of plays by Sophocles and Euripides. It is possible that the observers who informed Dio and Aelian mistook the Indian epics, like the Mahabharata and the Rig Veda, as that of Homer. Dio also tells us that Indian visitors and merchants were among his audience while he was giving speeches in Alexandria. Did he hear firsthand from these very same sources? Perhaps, or it could just be simple oratory embellishment. However, archaeological discoveries have since greatly illuminated our understanding of the intellectual life of the region during this time. Frankly, if there was to be any literature brought with the Greek conquerors, it would have been Homer. Well-educated Indians could have understood the similarities between the Greek epics and their own, and it has become clear that Homer in Greek mythology was known in both Central Asia and northwestern India. The stele of Sophitos demonstrated the knowledge of a man, likely of a Hellenized Indian background, who lived and died at Kandahar in Afghanistan, who was sufficiently learned enough to pay homage to Homer's Odyssey, and even more contemporary poets like Callimachus of Alexandria. Whether it was a direct consequence of Hellenistic rule, or as a byproduct of the trade with Rome, the local artists of Gandhara likely possessed a passing knowledge of Greek myth, and would even borrow scenes from the Homeric cycle, most famously exemplified by the panel depicting the Trojan horse. Several later Indian plays and stories may have adopted this tradition, retaining the concept of hiding soldiers inside of the belly of a wooden animal to break into the walls of a city, though the horse is appropriately substituted with that of an elephant. Plutarch's claims of Gadrosian renditions of Euripides and Sophocles may not be so far-fetched when we see the remains of a theatre at Ai-Khanoum and passages of an unknown drama recovered from its libraries. Indian theatre was practiced in the Vedic period, but there is no reason not to believe that the performances of the Greeks were not appreciated. Gandharan artwork with Dionysian undertones is often presented in a very theatrical manner, and the Sanskrit term referring to a painted background used for production is called a yavanika, little Greek thing. This appreciation for Greek arts may be seen in the tastes of the Kushan elite, who eagerly imported Roman goods like glassware and statues. Based on the materials recovered from sites like the Bagram Horde, it is quite likely that this demand was due to the legacy and influence of the Indo-Greeks, that the Kushan recognized the aspects of Hellenistic continuity in the Roman Empire as being similar to what they knew, and thus were happy to acquire these products and carry them into the afterlife. This is also likely why the Gandharan artists so heavily adopted Hellenistic motifs and designs into overwhelmingly Buddhist sculptures, drawing upon the imagery of Indo-Greek courts and the persistence of literary culture in the area. While sites like Ai-Khanoum were destroyed or abandoned, many of the settlements founded by the Greeks appeared to have prospered and retained a sense of Hellenic identity long afterwards. Alexandria and Arachosia is still described by Isidore of Carax as a flourishing metropolis during the 1st century AD, which is also likely confirmed by the Chinese description of Wu Yi Shanli. The Milinda Panha and other Pali texts refer to the city of Alessandra centuries after Indo-Greek rule, and Menander's capital of Sagala is described as a bustling center of commerce and organization. The continuity of Greco-Bactrian architecture in the Kushan Empire was also observed by Chinese travelers. A Tang period scholar who annotated the records of the Grand Historian quoted the now-lost work, the author of which noted that the cities of Da Yueshi, the Kushans, resembled those of the Da Qin, the Roman Empire, or, more broadly, the Greco-Roman tradition. Given the cultural reverence of Alexander the Great in both the Mediterranean and the Middle East, one may wonder if there was a lingering memory in the worlds of Central Asia and India. If we follow the accounts of those like Claudius Ptolemy, Strabo, and Isidore of Carax, several cities, for instance, Alexandria and Arachosia, continued to carry the name of the eponymous king after the end of the Greco-Bactrian and Indo-Greek kingdoms. Few, if any, pieces of Indian literature referred to Alexander's campaigns, though, which might be viewed from the Indian perspective as an extended raiding party rather than a grand conquest. By contrast, the Greco-Roman authors insist that there was a strong knowledge of Alexander. Referring to the giant altar set up by Alexander in honor of the Olympian pantheon at the banks of the Hyphasis River to commemorate the end of his journey, Plutarch suggests that the kings of the Praesi continued to venerate this spot and pay sacrifices in a Greek fashion. This sounds more akin to what might have been done when the Indo-Greeks occupied the Punjab. And like with the tale of Menander's funeral, this may indeed be a piece of information that fluttered into Plutarch's library from the east. Philostratus' account of Apollonius' travels in India include a description of Takshila that states, quote, "And they saw a temple. They saw, in front of the wall, which was not far short of 100 feet in size, made of porphyry, and there was constructed within it a shrine, for bronze tablets were nailed into each of its walls, on which were engraved the exploits of Porus and Alexander. The composition was like the subject of some famous painting by Zeuxis, or Polygnotus, and Euphranor, who delighted in light and shade, and, they say, here was also an appearance of real life, as well as depth and relief, and the metals were blended in the design, melted in like so many colors, and the character of the picture was also pleasing in itself, for Porus dedicated these designs after the death of the Macedonian, who was depicted in the hour of victory, restoring Porus who was wounded, and presenting him with India, which was now his gift." End quote. If these did exist, it is highly unlikely that these tablets were set up in the 4th century BC, but perhaps they were built on the orders of the Indo-Greeks. But is there anything in Central Asia? In the Tashkent National Museum of Uzbek History, there is a fresco recovered from Fayez Tepe, a Buddhist archaeological site dated to the Kushan period, showing what appears to be a man with divine attributes. More specifically, a halo and the presence of two curled ram horns. Could this be the horned incarnation of Alexander Ammon, famously depicted on the coins of Lysimachus and statues throughout the Mediterranean? Even the person's features share a strong resemblance to the Alexander mosaic recovered from Pompeii, supposedly based on a painting by the king's personal artist Apelles. It's an attractive theory, but some experts refute it by suggesting it was a wealthy female Buddhist patron, based upon similar headgear that was available to royal ladies in the region. Another example may be found at Tapa Shotor, a few miles south of Jalalabad, that possessed extraordinary carvings and one of the most impressive examples of later Gandharan art. Photographs show a large niche containing the Buddha, who sits between Heracles Vajrapani and a figure similar in form to the winged goddess Tyche. But among this group is an attendant of the Buddha that bears a heavy likeness to statues of Alexander the Great. Tragically, the monument has since been destroyed, and any further investigation is impossible. It is unfortunate that we must conclude our series on something of a melancholy note. Though Bactria and the rest of Central Asia were a hub of cultural exchange and activities for centuries, there is little surviving evidence that allows us to reconstruct the history of the Greco-Bactrians, the Indo-Greeks, or the Indo-Saka and the Kushans alike. Tragically, the turbulent geopolitical environment of nations like Afghanistan has threatened to destroy whatever is left. With the rise of religious extremist and insurgent groups such as the Taliban, there has been a dramatic increase in the number of looted and destroyed archaeological sites. These actions are often motivated by financial reasons. Soldiers, and sometimes impoverished local inhabitants, looking to plunder the remains of temples and old settlements in search of goods to sell on the antiquities market. Other times it is due entirely to ideological reasons, such as iconoclasm or anti-heretical zealotry. As such, the cultural loss has been staggering. Ai-Khanoum, formerly the most well-preserved Greco-Bactrian settlement to ever be discovered, now resembles a battlefield, with large craters pockmarking the surrounding area, thanks to the digging of prospective treasure hunters, eager to dig up an artifact or a coin hoard, who either use shovels or dynamite to get access to the goods beneath the earth. The Buddhas of Bamiyan were some of the largest known Buddhist statues in the world, measuring over 150 feet in height and carved out of a cliffside in the Bamiyan Valley of Afghanistan. Their creators were the heirs of the Gandharan school, and the monument was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site. But in 2001, they were blown up on the orders of the Taliban co-founder Mohammad Omar Mujahideen, citing idolatry. Tapa Shotor was also a victim of Taliban desecration and destroy during the Afghan Civil War of the 1990s. The Temple of Rabatak, which provided the key to unlocking the chronology of Kushan rule, was torn down using bulldozers shortly after the vandalism at Bamiyan. Civil wars and despotic regimes make archaeological missions challenging, and these groups are willing to turn a blind eye to the despoiling of dig sites and museums if it fits their ideological narrative, or they can receive monetary kickbacks. Many of our most extraordinary finds are only kept within the collections of private individuals, such as the stele of Sophitos. Who knows how many artifacts remain hidden amongst antiquities dealers and collectors that could potentially revolutionize our current understanding? This laundry list of grievances is not meant as an attack on the peoples of Afghanistan or any of the surrounding regions. The global demand for ancient art and artifacts compels these groups to provide them with the goods they are looking for. Poverty and the need to feed families in times of war often trump qualms about the loss of cultural heritage. This is also not a modern phenomenon either, as colonial powers of the 19th and 20th centuries eagerly took part in the hunt for buried coins, or stripped apart old Buddhist temples to stock their museums with magnificent statues and friezes. Ethics aside, it is certainly better to catalog and store these artifacts than see them destroyed, but due to the circumstances of their acquisition, it is almost impossible now to trace the provenance of many of these pieces, and so we lose valuable information provided by their original context. At the time of writing this in early 2022, The Taliban is now in control of Afghanistan once again, following the exit of American troops in the autumn of 2021. Their past willingness to participate in the wholesale destruction or exploitation of the cultural heritage of Afghanistan in the past does not suggest an amicable future for Central Asian studies. While this is a lamentable situation, there is a glimmer of hope. A dedicated community of scholars and officials, many of whom are from Central and South Asia, are willing to put themselves in harm's way to ensure the protection of these vulnerable archaeological sites and museum collections. Thanks to the internet, the digitization and archiving of thousands of Buddhist works of art from Gandhara has provided some degree of preservation in times of instability, and enabled academics from around the world to perform safer and more accessible research. In the face of issues like war and climate change, research is still being undertaken, with new finds appearing intermittently. It is unlikely that we will ever uncover another iconography, but any coin, pottery shard, or scrap of writing adds yet another piece of the puzzle to restore the history of the land of 1,000 cities. And with that, we will conclude our series on the Greco-Bactrians and Indo-Greeks. This was a monumental project, and arguably my most requested subject to cover, so I hope that this series has lived up to all of your expectations. So far, the response has been overwhelmingly positive, and many kind thoughts have been shared, so I thank you all so much for your patience as I chipped away at the finished project over the last 2 years. Given the sheer volume of research I have covered, my complete bibliography is pretty extensive, but at the time of this episode's release, I ought to have made available a reader's guide to Greco-Bactria and the Indo-Greeks in PDF format. Much like my other guides, it is a visual tool which gives a list of books which I have found to be particularly useful or relevant, along with the main primary sources. This will be found on my website, and also directly linked in the podcast description. With regards to the direction of the show, I have a few points to make. While this is the last scripted episode on the Hellenistic Far East, there are still 2 more interviews I have left to release. One on globalization between the Mediterranean and South Asia, and the other on the Kushan Empire. These will be shared over the next month or so, and will truly be the end of our series. Following that, there will be a couple of bonus episodes made available, since your generosity in my fundraiser for my trip to Rome earned you some extra content that I otherwise would not cover, so thank you all so much for your generosity. For those of you looking to donate, you can contribute to the show by dropping by my Ko-fi page or purchasing bookmarks from my Etsy store. You can always donate books for show research through the show's Amazon wishlist, and all of these links will be provided in the podcast description, as per usual. With Bactrian India now covered, we will move away from grand histories to focus more on cultural topics, namely literature during the Hellenistic Age. This includes the new comedy movement and the plays of Menander, the epic poetry of Apollonius of Rhodes and his Argonautica, the court poetry of Callimachus, and the bucolic verses of Theocritus, alongside a few others. Hellenistic literature will occupy us for the rest of the year, but by early 2023, we will return back to the main narrative, as we will move into the next phase of the show, the arrival of the Roman Republic into the affairs of the Hellenistic world.